Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The smell hit me first. Acrid, sulfurous, wrong. Not the pleasant autumn air I'd been breathing moments before while walking back from the battlefield tour, but something that scraped against the back of my throat like sandpaper soaked in chemicals. I stopped on the sidewalk outside the bed and breakfast, my rental car keys digging into my palm as my hand clenched involuntarily. The October wind carried nothing but the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Yet there it was again, sharp and unmistakable. Gunpowder. I'd come to Gettysburg for the ghost hunting weekend more out of curiosity than belief. The advertisements had promised authentic paranormal investigations, expert guides, and access to restricted areas of the battlefield after dark. What they'd delivered so far was a group of enthusiastic amateurs waving EMF meters at shadows, and a guide who spoke in theatrical whispers about residual energy. I'd been ready to write off the entire weekend as an elaborate tourist trap, return to my hotel room at the Covington house, and leave Sunday morning with nothing but a lighter wallet and some mediocre photographs. But the smell wouldn't leave. I climbed the creaking steps to the B&B's front porch, that chemical stench still clinging to my nostrils even as I inhaled deeply, trying to replace it with normal air. The Covington house stood on a street lined with period homes, each one claiming some tangential connection to the battle that had torn through this Pennsylvania town in July 1863. The proprietor, an elderly woman whose name I kept forgetting, had assured me that Confederate sharpshooters had used the third-floor windows during the battle. Whether this was historical fact or convenient fiction, I hadn't bothered to verify. The front door stuck as always, requiring a firm shoulder to unstick it from the swollen frame. Inside, the house maintained that peculiar silence that old buildings possess, not quite empty, but holding its breath. My footsteps on the hardwood floors seemed obscenely loud as I climbed to the third floor, where my room waited at the end of a narrow hallway lined with photographs of stern-faced men in Union and Confederate uniforms. The room itself was exactly as I'd left it that morning, bed made, curtains drawn back from the tall windows overlooking the street, my laptop sitting closed on the small writing desk. I dropped my keys on the nightstand and moved to the window, drawn by the fading light of early evening. From this height, I could see over the rooftops to where the battlefield stretched in the distance, those gentle hills that had seen such concentrated violence now peaceful and park-like in the autumn dusk. That's when I saw the first light, a small pinpoint of white, darting across the field in the distance, moving far too quickly and erratically to be a flashlight. It zipped left, then right, then simply vanished. I pressed closer to the glass, my breath fogging the old wavy pain, waiting for it to reappear. Nothing. Just the darkening fields and the distant tree line. I pulled back from the window, suddenly aware of how the temperature in the room had dropped. My breath was visible now, small clouds dissipating in the air before me. The radiator under the window clanked and hissed, supposedly working, but the cold seemed to seep up through the floorboards and down from the ceiling, surrounding me. The second light appeared closer, much closer. This one danced across the lawn of the house directly across the street, that same impossible white brilliance, there and gone in heartbeats. Then another, and another, 3 or 4 of them now, scattered across my field of vision, appearing and disappearing with no pattern I could discern. I grabbed my phone to film them, but by the time I had the camera app open, they'd all vanished. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the cold. The ghost hunt that evening was scheduled for 9 o'clock at Devil's Den, one of the most supposedly haunted locations on the battlefield. I had 2 hours to kill, so I did what any rational person would do. I researched. My laptop glowed in the gathering darkness of the room as I pulled up articles about Gettysburg phenomena. Ball lightning, I discovered, was a documented atmospheric occurrence. Swamp gas could create similar effects. The human brain was remarkably good at finding patterns in random stimuli, at creating meaning from chaos. but none of the explanations accounted for the smell of gunpowder that had preceded everything else. I caught myself glancing toward the window every few minutes, watching for more lights. The street below had grown dark, illuminated only by the weak glow of period-appropriate street lamps that the town maintained for atmosphere. Shadows pooled in doorways and between houses, and I found myself studying them, looking for movement that logic told me wouldn't be there. The radiator had stopped its clanking. The room remained cold. At 8:30, I forced myself to leave the room and head downstairs. The proprietor was nowhere to be seen, unusual for this time of evening. The parlor sat empty, its Victorian furniture arranged around a cold fireplace. I called out a greeting that echoed through the first floor, unanswered. The house felt larger in the darkness, the hallways stretching longer than they had in daylight, the ceiling pressing lower. I left for Devil's Den alone, driving through streets that seemed too empty for a Friday night in tourist season. The other ghost hunters were already gathered when I arrived. A dozen people huddled in the parking area, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Our guide was explaining something about Confederate sharpshooters using the massive boulders as cover, about the concentration of death in this small area, about how the stone itself might hold the memory of violence. I barely heard him. That smell was back, stronger now, mixing with the damp earth scent of the surrounding woods. Several others in the group commented on it. Someone suggested a reenactment group might be camping nearby. Someone else mentioned atmospheric conditions affecting olfactory perception. The guide just smiled in that knowing way that suggested he'd heard it all before and believed none of the rational explanations. We spread out among the boulders, each person or pair taking a section to investigate. I found myself alone in a narrow passage between two massive stones, my flashlight the only illumination. The October air had turned genuinely cold now, cold enough that I could see my breath even without the supernatural chill from earlier. I switched off my light, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, following the guide's instructions about being open to experience. The lights came back, not the distant darting points from before, but closer, brighter, moving between the boulders with purpose. I could hear the others exclaiming, their voices carrying through the rock passages, excited speculation about orbs and energy manifestations. But these lights weren't the vague photographic anomalies I'd seen in countless ghost hunting shows. These were distinct, solid, moving with intention through the spaces between the stones. One passed close enough that I felt warmth from it, incongruous in the cold air. Close enough that I smelled that gunpowder stench intensify. Close enough that for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something in the white brilliance. A shape, almost human, almost recognizable. Then it was gone, and I was alone in the dark with my heart hammering against my ribs. The guide found me 10 minutes later, still standing frozen in that passage. He asked if I was all right. I managed to nod, managed to say something about the cold getting to me. He suggested I head back, get some rest, perhaps try again tomorrow night. The others were having remarkable experiences, he said. The battlefield was active tonight. I drove back to the Covington house in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my eyes checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary. The streets were still empty. The other B&Bs and hotels I passed showed lit windows and signs of occupation, but no people, no movement, just buildings standing in the darkness like witnesses to something I couldn't name. The front door of the Covington house stuck again. I shouldered it open and climbed the stairs to the third floor, fatigue settling into my bones. The hallway photographs seemed to watch me pass, those stern faces tracking my movement. I fumbled with my room key, dropped it once before managing to get the door open. The cold hit me immediately. The room was freezing, far colder than it had been earlier. My breath formed thick clouds that hung in the air. The window stood open, which was impossible, because I distinctly remembered leaving it closed. And besides, these old windows required significant force to raise. I moved to close it, and that's when I smelled the gunpowder again. So strong now it made my eyes water. The lights were everywhere. Not outside this time, but in the room itself. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps. Small white pinpoints darting through the air like fireflies on fast forward. They moved around me, past me, through the space where I stood. The air felt thick, resistant, as if I were moving through water. Sound became muffled and distant. My own heartbeat seemed to echo from somewhere outside my body. I staggered to the bed and sat down hard, watching the lights dance and swirl. They were forming patterns now, configurations that almost made sense, almost resolved into something recognizable. Mathematical precision in chaos. Order in apparent randomness. My mind grasped for explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning, a stroke, some kind of mass hallucination affecting everyone who'd smelled the gunpowder, but none of them felt right. Gradually, over minutes or hours, I couldn't tell which, the lights began to fade. They didn't disappear all at once, but slowly winked out, like stars at dawn, until only one remained. This last light hung in the air near the window, brighter than the others, more solid somehow. It pulsed gently, a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat. Then it moved toward the chair beside the window and settled there. The light faded, but something remained. A silhouette, darker than the darkness around it. The shape of a man sitting in the chair, one leg crossed over the other, his posture relaxed as if he'd been sitting there for years, for decades, for more than a century and a half. I couldn't make out details, the darkness was too complete, but I could feel his presence, solid and undeniable. He was looking out the window, toward the battlefield, toward those gentle hills where violence had once consumed everything. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the room, out of the house, to drive until Gettysburg was far behind me. But I couldn't move. My body had frozen, locked in place by something stronger than fear. Not paralysis exactly, but a profound inability to disturb what was happening, as if movement would shatter something fundamental about the moment. The silhouette never turned toward me. It just sat there, watching the window, watching whatever it could see that I couldn't. Minutes passed. The cold remained. The smell of gunpowder lingered. My rational mind kept insisting this wasn't happening, that I was experiencing some kind of episode, that there would be a logical explanation in the morning. But morning felt impossibly far away. Finally, after an eternity compressed into minutes, the silhouette began to fade. Not suddenly, not with any dramatic flourish, but gradually, like an image overexposed to light, losing definition and substance until only the vaguest suggestion remained. Then nothing. Just an empty chair beside an open window in a cold room that smelled of old gunpowder. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, my back against the headboard, lights on, watching that chair. The proprietor never checked on me. No sounds came from the other rooms. The house remained silent, holding its breath, waiting. When dawn finally broke, weak gray light filtering through the still open window, I packed my things with shaking hands. I left money on the dresser for the room, more than was owed, and carried my bag down the stairs as quietly as possible. The front door opened easily this time, as if the house were ready to let me go. I drove straight through, stopping only for gas, not looking back at Gettysburg as it disappeared in my rearview mirror. But even now, weeks later, I smell gunpowder sometimes, in my apartment, in my office, in crowded restaurants, brief whiffs that no one else seems to notice. And sometimes in my peripheral vision, I see small white lights darting past, there and gone before I can turn to look directly. The rational explanations still line up neatly. Stress, suggestion, environmental factors, the power of belief. I recite them to myself like prayers. But late at night, when I'm alone and the darkness presses close, I remember that silhouette sitting by the window. I remember how solid it felt, how real, how undeniable, and I wonder if I'd turned to look at it directly, if I'd broken whatever spell kept me frozen, would I have seen a face? Would I have recognized the features of a young man who died on a Pennsylvania hillside in July 1863, who found himself still sitting in a third-floor room, still watching the battlefield, still waiting for something that would never come? Or would I have seen something else entirely? Something worse. Something that would have made me understand that what happened in Gettysburg wasn't about ghosts at all, but about places where reality had been wounded so deeply that the scar tissue never quite healed, where the past and present existed simultaneously, where the living and the dead occupied the same space without ever quite touching. I don't know. I'll never know. But sometimes, just before sleep takes me, I feel that cold again. I smell that gunpowder, and I sense someone sitting in the chair in the corner of my bedroom, the one I moved 3 times before giving up and leaving it where it wanted to be. Always facing the window, always watching, always waiting for me to finally turn and look directly at what sits there in the darkness, patient and eternal, ready to show me what I saw but didn't see, what I know but can't acknowledge, what has followed me home from Gettysburg like a shadow that's learned to exist without light. Story 2. The forest breathed around me as I pitched my tent in the clearing, 300 yards below the summit of Cold Mountain. October had stripped most of the leaves, leaving skeletal branches that clawed at the dimming sky. I'd chosen this spot deliberately, far from the marked campgrounds, away from the weekend hikers with their bright gear and loud voices. Up here, the silence felt absolute. That should have been my first warning. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, ever since the divorce papers were finalized. My therapist suggested I needed space to process, to reconnect with myself away from the apartment that still smelled like her perfume. The trail up had been brutal, 8 miles of switchbacks that left my thighs burning and my water bottles empty. But the exhaustion felt good, clean somehow. Physical pain I could understand. By the time I got the tent secured and my sleeping bag unrolled, the sun had dropped behind the western ridge. Shadows pooled between the trees like spilled ink. I built a small fire in the designated ring. Someone else had camped here before, though the ashes looked old, undisturbed by recent rain. The flames cast dancing patterns across the surrounding pines, making their trunks seem to sway even when the air was still. I ate my freeze-dried meal straight from the packet, barely tasting it, watching the fire slowly consume itself. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath now, small clouds that disappeared into the larger darkness. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Then another answered, closer than I expected. The sound made the hair on my neck prickle for reasons I couldn't quite name. Around 9 o'clock, I killed the fire and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag's synthetic warmth enveloped me, but sleep stayed elusive. My mind kept circling back to the apartment, to the papers on the kitchen table, to the way she'd looked at me when she said she couldn't do this anymore. Up here, those thoughts seemed smaller somehow, easier to hold at arm's length. That's when I heard the first footstep. At first, I convinced myself it was a deer. The sound came from maybe 20 feet away, the distinct crunch of something heavy on the carpet of dry leaves. I lay perfectly still, listening. Another step, then another. Too deliberate for an animal, too measured. Whatever was out there was taking its time, moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. Through the tent's thin nylon walls, I could make out vague shapes in the moonlight. The dark silhouettes of trees, the pale glow of the clearing. The footsteps continued their circuit, left to right, steady and unhurried. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but something stopped me, some primal instinct that said making noise would be a mistake. The steps paused directly behind my tent, so close I could hear breathing. Or maybe that was my own breath, shallow and quick in the confined space. I waited for a voice, for a flashlight beam, for any normal explanation. None came. The steps resumed, completing their circle and then fading into the forest. I lay awake for hours afterward, straining to hear any sound of return. The owl called again, farther away now. A breeze picked up, making the tent fabric ripple. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under into a sleep that felt more like drowning than rest. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the tent like dirty water. I woke with a headache pounding behind my eyes and my mouth tasting like copper. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then the memories of the night came flooding back. The footsteps, the breathing, the terrible weight of not knowing. I unzipped the tent and crawled out into air so cold it burned my lungs. Frost covered everything, transforming the clearing into something crystalline and unfamiliar. My boots crunched on the frozen ground as I stood, stretching muscles that had gone rigid during the night. That's when I saw it. Tied to one of my tent stakes with what looked like dried grass was a small bundle. Twigs woven together in a deliberate pattern, berries threaded through the gaps, dark purple ones I didn't recognize. The construction was intricate, almost beautiful in its precision. Someone had made this by hand, with care, and left it for me while I slept. My hands shook as I picked it up. The twigs were bound tight, the berries fresh enough to stain my fingers when I touched them. This wasn't something that had blown against my tent by accident. Someone had been here, had crouched down next to where I slept and carefully tied this offering to my stake. I spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest stood silent and empty, giving away no secrets. But I felt watched. That crawling sensation between your shoulder blades that says you're in someone's sights, even when you can't see them. I should have packed up right then. Should have hiked back down to the trailhead and my car and the world of electric lights and locked doors. Instead, I sat by the cold fire ring, turning the bundle over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. A gift? A warning? Some kind of mountain tradition I didn't know about? The rational part of my brain suggested an explanation. Another hiker playing a prank. Someone who'd spotted my tent and decided to mess with me. But that didn't account for the footsteps, the slow, deliberate way they'd circled my camp. The complete silence when they stopped. The breathing that might not have been breathing at all. I stuffed the bundle into my jacket pocket, telling myself I'd figure it out later. The summit was only a short hike from here, and I'd come too far to turn back without reaching it. The trail was easy to follow, a worn path through thinning trees, marked occasionally by cairns that other hikers had built over the years. As I climbed, the sun finally broke through the morning clouds, but its warmth felt distant and unconvincing. I kept pausing, listening for sounds behind me. Once I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching my pace, but when I stopped and turned, there was nothing. Just wind moving through the bare branches and the faint whisper of my own breathing. The summit was anticlimactic, a rocky outcropping with a weather-beaten sign, and a metal box containing a logbook for hikers to sign. I flipped through the pages, reading names and dates and brief enthusiastic messages. The most recent entry was from 3 weeks ago. Before that, a gap of nearly a month. Not a popular trail, apparently. But as I paged backward through the logbook, I found something that made my blood go cold. An entry from exactly 1 year ago, almost to the day. The handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible. It simply said, "Don't accept the token. Don't take it with you. For God's sake, leave it where you found it." No name. No date. Just those words pressed so hard into the paper that they'd torn through in places. I pulled the bundle from my pocket, holding it up in the sunlight. The berries seemed darker now, almost black. The twigs had a strange oily sheen. My skin crawled where I touched it. A sound rose from somewhere down the mountain, not quite human, not quite animal, a keening wail that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. It came in waves, building and falling, echoing off the rocks. I ran. The descent was a blur of loose stones and grabbing branches. I fell twice, skinning my palms, but I didn't stop. That sound followed me, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always there. When I finally reached my campsite, gasping and wild-eyed, I grabbed my gear and started stuffing it into my pack with shaking hands. The bundle had fallen from my pocket somewhere on the way down. Good. Let it stay lost in the forest where it belonged. But when I picked up my sleeping bag, something fell out of the folds. Another bundle, identical to the first. Impossible. I threw it away from me like it was burning. It landed near the fire ring. and I backed away, my mind fracturing. I'd lost the first one. I was sure of it, unless I hadn't, unless I'd put it in my pack, unless my memory was lying to me. The sun was directly overhead now, but the clearing felt darker than it had at dawn. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching. I could hear my pulse in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out rational thought. I grabbed my pack and ran for the trail, not bothering to properly secure the straps, not looking back. The descent should have taken 3 hours. I did it in 90 minutes, practically falling down the switchbacks, my ankles screaming with each jarring impact. The parking lot was empty except for my car, sitting exactly where I'd left it. Normal. Real. I fumbled my keys from my pocket and nearly sobbed with relief when the door unlocked. It wasn't until I was 5 miles down the mountain road, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, that I realized I could still feel the weight of something in my jacket pocket. I pulled over, heart hammering. Slowly, I reached into the pocket. My fingers closed around something rough and fibrous. I pulled it out. The bundle, perfectly intact, berries glistening like wet eyes. I never put it back in my pocket. That night in my apartment, I tried to throw it away 3 times. Each time I'd turn around and find it sitting on my kitchen counter or my nightstand or the bathroom sink, waiting. A week later, I went back to the ranger station to ask about the trail. The older man behind the desk leaned back in his chair when I mentioned Cold Mountain, his expression going carefully neutral. There'd been an incident last year, he said. A hiker had gone missing near the summit. They found him eventually, after 4 days of searching. He was alive but wouldn't speak, just kept making this sound, over and over, like an animal caught in a trap. They took him to a hospital down in the valley. The diagnosis was complete psychological breakdown, though he'd had no history of mental illness. The ranger's eyes were tired when he looked at me. He mentioned, almost casually, that the missing hiker had been found holding something, a bundle of twigs and berries, woven together with grass. They'd had to pry it from his fingers. I didn't tell him about the bundle in my pocket, about how I wake up sometimes to find it sitting on my pillow, inches from my face, about the footsteps I hear outside my apartment now, circling, patient, waiting. I don't tell anyone, because the worst part isn't the bundle that won't disappear, or the sounds that follow me, or the way shadows sometimes move wrong in my peripheral vision. The worst part is that I've started to understand. The bundle isn't a warning. It's not a gift. It's a mark. And whatever left it knows exactly where to find me. Every night, just after I turn off the lights, I hear them. Footsteps outside my window. 3rd floor, fire escape 30 feet away, but I hear them anyway. That same measured pace, circling, always circling, getting closer with each rotation. Sometimes I think about the hiker they found, wonder if he's still in that hospital, still making that sound. Wonder if he also tried to explain about the token, about the impossibility of it, about the terrible logic that says some gifts can never be returned. The berries in my pocket have started to pulse. I can feel it through the fabric. A slow, steady rhythm. Almost like a heartbeat. Almost like they're counting down to something. I check the calendar obsessively now. October again. 1 year since that night on the mountain. 1 year since I heard those first footsteps in the dark. Tomorrow is the anniversary. Exactly 1 year to the day. The footsteps outside have stopped circling. Now they're just waiting. Story 3. My brother stopped calling after the 3rd week of November. Not completely. He'd still answer when I reached out, voice tight and professional like he was talking to dispatch instead of family. But those late-night calls where he'd decompress after shift, spilling the peculiar horror of his paramedic work over cheap beer and distance, those stopped cold. When I asked him why, he said something about needing boundaries, about not bringing the job home anymore. His laugh afterward sounded like aluminum foil crumpling. I should have let it go. Instead, I drove the 4 hours to his apartment on a Saturday in early December, telling myself it was just a brotherly check-in, nothing strange about wanting to see him. The city looked different than I remembered from my last visit. Grayer somehow, though that might have been the weather. Buildings seemed to lean inward over the streets, their windows catching the weak afternoon light like cataracts. His apartment was on the third floor of a converted industrial building, the kind with exposed brick and pipes that landlords call character. The stairwell smelled of mildew and something else, something organic and sweet that made me breathe through my mouth. Each step produced a slight give, as if the concrete had gone soft. He answered on the fourth knock, and I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he'd changed physically. He looked exactly the same close-cropped hair, same sharp jaw, but because of how he held himself. Contracted, like he was trying to occupy less space than his body required. The apartment behind him was obsessively clean. I could smell bleach, astringent and chemical. Every surface gleamed. He noticed me noticing. His explanation came quickly, too practiced. Just maintaining standards, keeping things sterile. You never know what you bring home from work. He moved aside to let me in, and I caught the slight wince as his shoulder brushed the door frame, like even that casual contact required negotiation. We talked about nothing for an hour. Weather, sports, our parents' upcoming anniversary. But his eyes kept drifting to his phone, and I realized he was tracking the time. Not just glancing, tracking it. The way you track something that might run out. I asked him directly what was wrong. His face did something complicated, multiple expressions fighting for dominance before settling into careful neutrality. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me. Then he shook his head and said he was tired, that's all. The job gets heavy sometimes. The deflection would have worked if I hadn't seen his hands. He'd been gripping his beer bottle for 10 minutes without drinking, and when he finally set it down, the glass was clouded with moisture and body heat. But more than that, his palm had left an impression in the condensation that looked too deep, the ridges of his fingerprints visible like a forensic mold. I stared at it longer than I should have. He cleared his throat, breaking my focus, and suggested we get dinner. His voice carried an urgency that had nothing to do with hunger. We left the apartment, and I tried not to notice how he hesitated before turning his back on the furniture. Over Thai food that neither of us finished, he finally began to talk. Not about what was wrong, but about work, about the calls that stick with you. He spoke clinically at first, using medical terminology like armor, but eventually the professional distance began to crack. He described a call from mid-November, a welfare check on a man who hadn't been seen in weeks. The building superintendent had reported a smell. My brother said the words casually, but his fork scraped against the plate with enough force to leave marks. They'd found the man in his living room, seated on a sectional couch that was probably nice once. Upholstery was patterned with flowers, he said, the detail oddly specific. The man weighed somewhere north of 500 pounds. That wasn't the problem. My brother had handled bariatric patients before. The problem was that he'd been sitting there for so long that he'd begun to merge with the furniture. The way my brother described it, the man's skin had broken down where it pressed against the cushions, moisture and pressure creating conditions for tissue to simply give up being separate. When they tried to move him, tried to get a backboard underneath for transport, portions of him stayed behind. Not bleeding, my brother emphasized, just separating, like wet paper towel lifting away from a surface. The man had been conscious. That was what seemed to haunt my brother most. Conscious and apologizing, saying he was sorry for the trouble, sorry for the mess, his voice wet and small. I asked if the man survived. My brother's jaw tightened and he said they got him to the ER, that he was treated, that he was alive. But his eyes suggested the question of survival was more complicated than vitals and discharge papers. There had been another call, he continued, voice dropping lower, though the restaurant wasn't particularly crowded. A homeless man with a foot infection that had gone septic. My brother's partner had been examining the injury, gentle as possible, when the foot had simply come away. Not amputated, not torn, released, like it had been waiting for permission to detach. The man had looked down at his own foot sitting separate on the gurney and laughed. High and breathless, a sound that my brother said he still heard sometimes when things got too quiet. I wanted to offer comfort. to say something about the difficulty of emergency medicine, about trauma and resilience. But something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't telling me these stories to process them. He was warning me. The check came and he grabbed it before I could reach, hands moving with nervous precision. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and my breath came out in visible clouds that hung in the still air longer than they should have. My brother walked quickly toward his building, and I noticed his gait had changed. Shorter steps, weight carefully distributed, like he was navigating terrain that might give way. Back in his apartment, he became more animated, more like himself. He opened another beer, asked about my job, laughed at a joke I made about my landlord, but underneath the normalcy, I could sense him waiting for something. The way his eyes would unfocus slightly every few minutes, attention turning inward or outward, I couldn't tell which. Around 11, I said I should head to my hotel. He insisted I stay, said he had an air mattress, no point in paying for a room. His insistence had an edge that made refusal feel cruel. So I agreed, and he seemed to relax fractionally, shoulders dropping a half-inch. He set up the air mattress in the living room with meticulous care, checking the seal, ensuring proper inflation. The attention he paid to it seemed excessive until I realized what he was actually doing, making sure I wouldn't sink into it, that I'd remain separate from its surface. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels actively maintained. Every small sound I made, shifting position, adjusting the blanket, seemed amplified, intrusive. I became hyper-aware of the points where my body touched the mattress, the pillow, the sheet. Contact began to feel like commitment. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement from my brother's bedroom. Not walking, but a continuous soft sound like fabric dragging across fabric. It went on for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Then silence again, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd let his stories get inside my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was occupied, that something was listening as intently as I was. Morning came gray and gradual. I found my brother already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his eyes were bright, almost feverish. He asked how I slept, and I lied and said fine. Over breakfast that neither of us ate, he told me more. Not about specific calls this time, but about something he'd started noticing. A pattern, maybe, or a feeling. He said that after enough time responding to certain scenes, you start to sense something beneath the surface. Entropy, he called it, though that wasn't quite right. More like gravity, but operating on a different axis. Pull instead of push. People getting stuck, he said. Not metaphorically, physically stuck. To chairs, to beds, to the corners they'd backed themselves into. The adhesion starting subtle, just skin cells and moisture and time, but gradually becoming something more binding, something reciprocal. The furniture holding the person, but also the person holding the furniture, neither willing or able to release. He spoke faster now, words tumbling over each other, said he'd been researching it, trying to find medical literature, case studies, anything to explain what he was seeing. But the thing about deterioration is that it's individual until suddenly it's pattern. One person fused to a couch is medical crisis, 10 people is something else, something that doesn't fit in diagnosis codes and treatment protocols. I asked him how many cases he'd responded to. He didn't answer directly, just said enough, more than made sense statistically, more than coincidence could explain. His eyes drifted to the couch behind me, and I felt an irrational urge not to turn around, not to acknowledge it. He asked me if I ever felt it, the pull of staying. Not just choosing to remain in one place, but the actual physical resistance to movement, the sense that separation requires more energy than rest. The way your body settles into a chair, and the chair settles into you, and the boundary between becomes negotiable. I told him no, I didn't feel that. His expression suggested he didn't believe me. The rest of the morning passed in uncomfortable tension. We made plans for lunch that both knew we'd cancel. I gathered my things slowly, feeling the weight of obligation to stay warring with the instinct to leave. When I finally stood at his door, overnight bag in hand, he gripped my shoulder with careful force. His advice came quiet and urgent. Keep moving. Don't get comfortable anywhere too long. Watch for the signs. When I asked what signs, he said I'd know. The feeling of being held, the resistance to rising, the way surfaces begin to remember your shape. I drove home faster than I should have, stopping twice for coffee I didn't drink just to break up the trip, to avoid too much continuous sitting. The highway stretched ahead, repetitive and hypnotic, and I had to consciously vary my position every few minutes, shifting weight, adjusting posture. My apartment felt foreign when I finally reached it. I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The worn depression in my desk chair's cushion, shaped precisely to my body, the couch with its permanent divots, the mattress that cradled my weight with the intimacy of long familiarity. That night I couldn't settle. I'd start to sit, then stand, lie down, then get up. Every surface felt like a commitment, every moment of rest like negotiation. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd let my brother's anxiety infect my own thinking. But in the small hours of the morning, lying in bed but not sleeping, I became aware of the contact points between my body and the mattress, the pressure, the give, the way the foam compressed beneath me, creating a precise hollow that matched my contours exactly. I tried to shift position and felt, just for an instant, the smallest resistance. Not external, the mattress didn't hold me, but something in my own body hesitated, comfort and inertia creating a whisper of adhesion that required conscious effort to break. I got up immediately, heart racing with irrational fear, walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping city, all those buildings full of people in beds and chairs, resting peacefully against surfaces that knew their shapes by heart. My phone showed 3 a.m. I called my brother. No answer. I've been standing at this window for 2 hours now. My legs ache, my back aches, but every time I consider sitting down, I think about that instant of hesitation, that microscopic moment of holding. I think about my brother's apartment, so carefully clean, all that bleach trying to erase whatever invisible process he'd convinced himself was occurring. I think about people settling into their lives, into their routines, into the furniture that shapes itself around them with patient incremental pressure. The boundary between person and place growing thinner with each hour of contact, each day of habit, each year of comfortable repetition. The sky is starting to lighten now, gray bleeding into the darkness. I should move, make coffee, start the day. But my feet feel heavy, and the floor beneath them feels peculiarly solid, and I'm suddenly uncertain whether standing still for too long might be its own kind of adhesion. My brother was right. You do know the signs. You feel the pull. The question is whether the pull is real, or whether knowing about it is enough to make it manifest, a tension creating the very adhesion you're trying to avoid. Either way, I don't think I can stay here. Either way, I'm not sure leaving will help. The window glass is cold against my forehead. I don't remember leaning against it. I should step back, break contact, keep moving like my brother said. In a moment. Just a moment more. Story 4. The smell hits you first. Always does. Even through the respirator, even through the industrial-grade ventilation system humming in the corner. You can taste it in the back of your throat, copper and decay and something else. Something that doesn't belong in any textbook about decomposition. It's the smell of a place where terrible things happened, where the walls themselves absorbed what transpired, and now leak it back into the air, molecule by molecule. I've been doing this for 11 years. Crime scene remediation, the business cards say. Trauma scene biorecovery, if you want to sound clinical. What it really means is I'm the guy who shows up after everything else is gone, the bodies, the detectives, the yellow tape, and I make it look like nothing ever happened. I scrub away the evidence of the worst days of people's lives, I'm good at it. Maybe too good. The house on Maple Drive looked normal from the outside. Red brick, white trim, a lawn that needed mowing. The kind of place where you'd expect to see a tire swing and a golden retriever. The kind of place where neighbors would tell news cameras they never saw it coming, that the family seemed so normal, so happy. My equipment filled the front hallway. Industrial cleaners, scrapers, plastic sheeting, biohazard bags stamped with warnings in 3 languages. I'd read the police report. Basic facts, nothing more. I never wanted to know the details. Knowing makes it harder, but you can't help picking up things. A father, his wife, 2 small ones, the whole family, gone in one night. The living room wasn't bad, the kitchen either. Most of the work would be upstairs. I could see the staircase from where I stood, each step seeming narrower than the last, the landing above swallowed in shadow despite the afternoon light coming through the windows. My hands were already gloved, suited up in the white Tyvek that made me look like an astronaut exploring hostile terrain. Which, in a way, I was. I should have started with the master bedroom. That's where most of it happened, according to the report's careful euphemisms. But my feet carried me to the smaller room at the end of the hall. The door stood ajar, just enough to see the edge of a dresser painted pale blue, a corner of poster on the wall showing cartoon animals whose names I didn't know. The handprints covered the western wall. Small, so impossibly small. Pressed against the paint in dark rust brown, fingers splayed, reaching up as high as they could reach. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, layered over each other in a chaos of panic that made my chest tighten. Some smeared where small palms had slid down, some sharp and clear enough that you could count the tiny fingertips. They started at floor level and climbed higher, higher, as if trying to escape through the wall itself. I'd seen bad things before. I'd cleaned up suicides, accidents, overdoses. Once I spent 3 days scrubbing an apartment where someone hadn't been found for 2 weeks in August heat. But this was different. These weren't just stains. These were the last desperate moments of someone so small, they still left handprints instead of fingerprints in the evidence photos. Professional distance, that's what the trauma counselor at my first seminar had called it. Treat it like any other job. Don't think about who, only about what. Surface area, chemical compounds, proper disposal protocols. I started with the door frame. Always work your way in, never the other way around. The dried residue came off easier than expected, flaking away under the enzyme cleaner, leaving behind only faint shadows in the paint. The walls would need to be repainted anyway. The whole house would need to be repainted. Probably torn down, if I was being honest. Some places can't be saved. 2 hours in, my back aching from the careful, methodical work, I heard it. A soft sound, barely there, like a whisper of movement from the floor above. I froze, scrub brush suspended in mid-motion. The house was supposed to be empty. The real estate agent had assured me of that, had given me the only key. I strained my ears, hardly breathing. The ventilation system hummed. A floorboard creaked. Old houses do that, settling, shifting with temperature changes. Nothing more. I returned to work, but the ease had left me. I found myself glancing at the doorway, at the darkened hall beyond. The afternoon light was failing earlier than I'd expected, or maybe I'd lost track of time. That happened sometimes, when you got deep into the work. Your mind wandered to protect itself, and hours slipped past like minutes. The handprints on the lower portion of the wall were the worst. These were the freshest, the most defined. I could see the fine lines of tiny palms, the whorls of impossibly small fingers. My own daughter was grown now, off at college studying something I didn't quite understand involving computers and networks. But I remembered when her hands were this small, remembered the way they'd grab my fingers with that surprising grip babies have. I had to stop, put down the brush, breathe through the tightness in my throat. That's when I noticed the closet door was open. I was certain, absolutely certain, it had been closed when I entered the room. I had a system. I always checked closets first, made sure spaces were clear. It's a safety thing. You never know what you might find. And the closet in this room had been closed. I'd seen it closed. had made a mental note to check it after finishing the wall. Now it stood ajar, just a few inches, a wedge of darkness visible in the gap. The house settled again, a long groan of wood and nails. Just the temperature changing, I told myself. Doors shift in old houses. Hinges loosen. It didn't mean anything. I crossed to the closet, pulled the door fully open. Inside, clothes still hung on small hangers. Shoes lined up on the floor in descending sizes. On the shelf above, stuffed animals stared down with button eyes, their stitched smiles somehow obscene in this place. Nothing else. No one hiding. Nothing wrong. When I turned back, I could have sworn the handprints on the wall had changed position. Impossible, obviously. Completely impossible. Dried blood doesn't move. It doesn't shift or rearrange itself when you're not looking. It was the light, or eye fatigue, or my mind playing tricks after too many hours breathing chemical fumes through a mask. I'd seen optical illusions before at scenes like this. The brain does strange things when confronted with trauma. It fills in gaps, creates patterns, invents movement where there is none. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the prints higher up on the wall, the ones that climbed toward the ceiling in that desperate reaching pattern, hadn't been quite so high before. I finished the lower section as the sun set fully, the room sinking into shadow despite the work lights I'd set up. The prints came away reluctantly here, as if they'd soaked deeper into the paint. Some scrubbing left marks, gouges in the drywall beneath. I'd have to patch those before the painters came. More work, more time in this room where the air itself felt wrong. My phone buzzed. A text from my wife asking when I'd be home. I told her late, not to wait up. She was used to it. 11 years, and she'd learned not to ask too many questions about where I'd been or what I'd seen. That was the unspoken agreement in our marriage now. I carried the weight alone so she wouldn't have to. But even she had noticed something changing in me over the past year. The way I'd startle at sudden sounds. The nightmares I claimed not to remember. The fact that I'd started sleeping in the guest room more often than not, claiming my odd hours would disturb her rest. The truth was simpler and more complicated. I couldn't bear the thought of waking her with my screaming. Because lately, I'd started bringing things home with me. Not physical things. Nothing I could wash off in the decontamination shower I'd installed in the garage. These were fragments of other people's horror that lodged somewhere behind my eyes, that replayed in the dark hours before dawn. The violence I cleaned away during the day returned in my sleep, vivid and immediate. A sound from downstairs snapped me back to the present. Distinct this time. Definite. Footsteps. I stood slowly, every muscle tensed. Called out that I was upstairs, that I was the remediation specialist, that I was supposed to be here. No response. The footsteps continued, a slow, deliberate pace across what sounded like the living room floor. Could be the real estate agent, I reasoned. Maybe she'd forgotten something, come back to check on progress. But she would have called out, wouldn't she? Would have announced herself. I moved to the bedroom doorway, looked out into the hall. The landing was dark now, my work lights not reaching that far. The staircase descended into shadow. The footsteps had stopped. Something made me reach for the light switch by the door. I flicked it, and the overhead light blazed to life, filling the room with harsh illumination that made me squint after hours of softer work lights. The wall behind me was covered in handprints again, not just the ones I hadn't cleaned yet. All of them. Hundreds of them, layered and overlapping, covering every inch of the western wall from floor to ceiling. Fresh-looking, wet-looking. Some still seemed to glisten in the overhead light. I spun away, pressed my back against the door frame, breathing hard into my respirator. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. I'd cleaned that section, watched the prints disappear under enzyme solution and scrubbing and simple chemical reactions. They were gone. They were gone. But when I forced myself to look again, they were still there. Dozens of small hands reaching, pressing, searching for escape that would never come. My phone rang, the sound obscenely loud in the silent house. I fumbled it from my pocket with shaking hands. my wife's name on the screen. I answered, tried to make my voice sound normal, but she knew immediately something was wrong. That's 23 years of marriage for you. She could read my moods across digital signals and miles of distance. She asked if I was okay, if I needed her to come get me. I told her no, I was fine, just tired. Just tired, that's all. Would be home soon. I hung up before she could press further. Couldn't let her hear the edge of panic in my voice. Couldn't admit that I was standing in a room where the laws of physical reality no longer seemed to apply, where the walls remembered things they shouldn't. When I looked at the wall again, the prints were gone. The section I'd cleaned remained clean. The section I hadn't reached yet still showed the original pattern, exactly as it had been. Nothing had changed. Nothing had ever changed. I'd imagined it. All of it. The optical illusion of a fatigued mind, working too long in a traumatic environment. The counselor had warned about this. Intrusive images, false memories, the brain's attempt to process horror by creating horror. It wasn't real. It had never been real. But my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down on the floor, back against the wall opposite the handprints, and focus on breathing until the shaking stopped. I should have left then. Should have packed my equipment, locked the door behind me, driven home to my wife and my normal life and never looked back. Let someone else finish this job. There were other companies, other technicians who could handle it. Instead, I stayed. Because that's what I do. I finish what I start. I make the bad things go away so other people don't have to see them. The handprints yielded to the chemicals and the scrubbing, inch by inch, print by print. I worked methodically, not thinking, not letting myself think. By midnight, the western wall was bare, stained and pitted, needing patching and paint, but clean. No more small hands reaching toward a ceiling they'd never reach. I was packing up my equipment when I saw the new prints on the eastern wall. These weren't the same. These were at adult height, pressed against the paint in the same rust brown, but larger. A woman's hands, I thought, by the size and shape. Both palms flat against the wall, fingers spread wide, as if she'd been pushed there and had tried to brace herself against the force. These hadn't been in the police report. I was sure of it. They'd documented every stain, every spatter, every piece of evidence. These prints weren't part of the original scene, unless I'd missed them somehow, unless they'd been there all along and I simply hadn't noticed until now. My focus entirely consumed by the smaller prints that had drawn my eye like magnets. Yes, that had to be it. I'd missed them. In the poor light, in my fatigue, I'd simply overlooked them. But I hadn't brought enough chemicals for another wall. I'd calculated based on the scene photos, on the square footage described in the report. These new prints would require another trip to the supply warehouse, another day added to the job. Or I could leave them. Tell myself I'd come back tomorrow with fresh supplies and fresh eyes. Get out of this house that seemed to breathe around me, that creaked and shifted like a living thing. I chose to leave. Packed my equipment in the van, stripped off the Tyvek suit, sealed it in a biohazard bag. Locked the front door with the same key the real estate agent had given me. Got in my van and drove away from the house on Maple Drive without looking back. But I saw them in my rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. Small faces in the upstairs window, 2 of them. Pale and indistinct in the darkness, but there, watching me leave. I stopped the van in the middle of the street, looked back at the house. The window was empty, dark and vacant like all the other windows. Nothing there. Had never been anything there. At home, I stood in the garage decontamination shower for 20 minutes, water as hot as I could stand it, scrubbing my skin until it hurt. My wife was asleep when I finally crept upstairs. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her breathe in the darkness, and wondered what I would tell her if I told her anything at all. What could I say? That I thought I'd seen something that couldn't be real? That I was losing my grip on what separated the horror I cleaned from the horror my mind invented? That every scene I worked stayed with me a little longer, weighed a little heavier, until I couldn't tell anymore where the job ended and I began. I couldn't burden her with that. She'd married a man who had a strange job, sure, but a sane man. A stable man. Not someone who saw faces in windows and handprints that appeared and disappeared. Not someone who might be unraveling, thread by thread. So I said nothing, closed the door quietly, went to the guest room, lay awake until dawn thinking about small hands and what they'd been reaching for. The next morning I called the real estate agent, told her I'd finished the initial assessment, that the job would take longer than expected, asked if anyone else had been in the house, if any other workers were scheduled. She assured me I had exclusive access, that the house was secure, that no one else would be there. Then she mentioned something odd. The family who'd lived there before the incident, she said. Tragedy aside, they'd always complained about sounds in the house, footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening on their own. She laughed nervously, said every old house has its quirks, that it was probably just settling. But the way she said it, the forced casualness in her voice, made me think she didn't quite believe that herself. I didn't go back to the house that day, or the next. I called in sick, told them I needed a few personal days. My wife fussed over me, brought me tea, asked if I was running a fever. I told her I was just tired, that's all. On the third day, she found me in the garage at 2 a.m., standing in front of the wall where I'd hung my tools. She asked what I was doing. I couldn't tell her I was trying to remember if I'd cleaned my hands well enough, if any trace of the house on Maple Drive still clung to my skin, if I might have brought something home with me after all. She guided me back to bed, her hand warm on my back, and I let her think this was just another rough patch, another bad job that would fade with time. Let her hold on to the fiction that her husband was the same man she'd married, not someone slowly coming apart in ways he couldn't explain. But that night I dreamed of handprints, small ones climbing walls reaching toward light that never came. And in the dream, I was on the other side of the wall, able to see what they were reaching for, what they were trying to escape. When I woke, I couldn't remember what I'd seen, only that it was still there, waiting in that house, in that room where tiny hands had left their last marks on a world that hadn't saved them. I still haven't gone back. The real estate agent has called twice, left voicemails asking about the schedule, about when I'll finish. I haven't returned her calls. Can't. Because I'm not sure what I'd find if I went back. Not sure if those handprints would still be there, or if they'd multiply, or if I'd discover they'd never been real to begin with. Some nights, lying awake in the guest room, I think about calling someone, a doctor maybe, or the counselor from that first seminar, the one who talked about professional distance and mental health, and knowing when you've had enough. But what would I tell them? That I see things, that I'm no longer certain where the evidence ends and my imagination begins? Or worse, that I'm starting to suspect those handprints knew I was coming, that they were waiting for someone like me, someone who'd spent 11 years absorbing other people's nightmares, someone who'd worn down his defenses until there was nothing left to separate him from the horror he was supposed to clean. My wife asks sometimes why I stopped taking jobs. I tell her I'm thinking about a career change, maybe something less demanding. She smiles, relieved, says she thinks that's wonderful, asks what I might do instead. I don't tell her I can't do anything else. Can't focus, can't sleep, can't stop thinking about a room I'll never enter again, and handprints I may have imagined. Can't stop wondering if, somewhere in that house on Maple Drive, small hands are still reaching, still waiting for someone to understand what they were trying to say. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in Station 47 hummed with that particular frequency that burrowed into your skull after the first few hours of a night shift. I'd been staring at the same incident report for 20 minutes, the words blurring together into meaningless shapes. Outside, the October wind scraped dead leaves across the parking lot with a sound like fingernails on concrete. 3 a.m., the witching hour, my old partner used to call it, back before he transferred to days, back before he stopped meeting my eyes in the locker room. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, a thin film forming across its surface like skin. I should have gotten up to make a fresh pot, but something about the stillness of the station kept me pinned to my chair. the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something, like the air itself is holding its breath. That's when the door alarm chimed. The sound cut through the quiet with mechanical precision. 3 sharp tones that meant someone had triggered the motion sensor at the main entrance. I pushed back from the desk, my chair wheels squeaking against the linoleum, and moved toward the day room where the monitors displayed feeds from our security cameras. The screen showed nothing. Empty parking lot, empty entrance. Just the sodium lights casting their sickly orange glow across the pavement and the wind pushing trash in lazy circles. I waited, watching the timestamp in the corner tick forward. Sometimes the sensor glitched, triggered by a strong gust or a passing animal. Sometimes the alarm chimed again. My pulse kicked up a notch, that old familiar spike of adrenaline that never fully goes away no matter how many years you spend on the job. I crossed to the door itself, peered through the reinforced glass panel. The entrance bay stretched out before me, empty and sterile under the harsh lights. The automatic doors were closed. Nobody stood waiting. Nobody moved in the shadows. But the motion sensor's red light blinked steadily, insistent, active. I pressed my palm against the glass, felt its coolness against my skin. My reflection stared back at me, dark circles under my eyes, the gray that had started creeping into my temples more aggressively these past few months. I looked tired. I looked old. The sensor's light went dark. I exhaled, felt some of the tension bleed from my shoulders. Glitch. Had to be. I turned back toward the day room, already thinking about that fresh pot of coffee, when the radio crackled to life. Static at first. That deep, churning static that sounds almost organic, like something breathing through machinery. Then, cutting through it with perfect clarity, a voice. A little girl's voice. "You can't save everyone." The words hung in the air, so clear and distinct they might have been spoken right beside me. My hand froze on the doorframe. Every hair on my arm stood on end, my skin suddenly too tight, too cold. The radio sat on the charging dock across the room, its screen displaying the dispatch channel's frequency. I stared at it, willing my legs to move, to cross the distance and check the log, see who had transmitted. But my body wouldn't obey. Some ancient part of my brain screamed at me to stay perfectly still, the way prey freezes when a predator passes too close. The static resumed, then cut out. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I forced myself forward, each step deliberate. Picked up the radio with hands that wanted to shake. Checked the display. No transmission log. No missed calls. No indication that anyone had broadcast anything at all. My mouth had gone dry. I keyed the mic, heard my own voice crack slightly as I spoke into it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. Radio check." The response came immediately, professional and bored. Dispatch confirmed my transmission, asked if there was a problem. I told them negative, just routine check, and signed off. My voice sounded normal, steady, like someone who wasn't standing in an empty station at 3 a.m. questioning what he'd just heard. I set the radio down carefully, as if it might shatter, or as if it might speak again. The reasonable explanations lined up neatly in my mind. Cross-channel interference. Some kid with a CB radio, making prank calls. A fragment of an old transmission bouncing through the atmosphere at just the right frequency. These things happened. The radio spectrum was crowded, unpredictable. But that voice had been so clear, so close. And those words. You can't save everyone. Every EMT knows it. It's the truth that sits in your chest like a stone. The thing you learned during your first code when you're doing compressions and feeling ribs crack under your palms and watching the monitor stay flat. You learn it when you roll up on scenes where you're already too late, where all you can do is call time of death and mark it down in your report. It's the thing we don't say out loud, the thing we carry. I moved back to my desk on autopilot, sat down, tried to focus on the incident report again. The words still wouldn't come together. My eyes kept drifting to the radio, to the door, to the windows that looked out onto the darkened ambulance bay where our rig sat waiting, its white paint almost luminous under the lights. 23 minutes passed. I counted them, watching the clock on the wall tick through each second with methodical precision. 23 minutes of nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the whisper of the HVAC system and my own breathing. Then the door alarm chimed again. This time I was up immediately, crossing to the monitors, pulling up the camera feeds with quick, practiced movements. The entrance showed the same empty view, but now I cycled through all the cameras, the parking lot, the ambulance bay, the side entrance, the rear dock. Nothing. Everywhere. Nothing. The alarm chimed again. And again. 3 times in quick succession, like someone was pacing back and forth through the sensor's range. But the cameras showed only emptiness. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt, felt its familiar weight in my hand, and moved toward the door. The smart thing would have been to stay inside, to call for backup, to let someone else check it out. But 8 years on the job had worn down my sense of appropriate caution. Or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation. The door's manual release clicked under my hand. I pushed it open, felt the October wind hit my face with biting intensity. It carried the smell of dead leaves and distant smoke from someone's fireplace. Normal autumn smells. Safe, familiar smells. I stepped out onto the concrete, sweeping the flashlight beam across the entrance area. The sensor was mounted above the doorway, a small black box with its red LED dark now, inactive. I moved directly through where its detection range would be. Nothing happened. I stood there for a long moment, feeling foolish, feeling watched. That prickling sensation between your shoulder blades that evolution developed to warn us when predator eyes are tracking our movement. I turned slowly, scanning the parking lot, the street beyond, the dark windows of the buildings across the way. Empty, everything empty. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and this time I engaged the manual deadbolt. The metallic click sounded too loud in the quiet station. The rest of the shift stretched ahead of me like a dark tunnel. 4 more hours. 4 more hours of fluorescent lights and coffee, and waiting for the tones to drop, for a call to come through, for something normal to happen that would push the strangeness back into the corners where it belonged. I made it almost an hour before the radio spoke again. This time I was in the kitchen, pouring that fresh pot of coffee I'd promised myself. The radio was back in the day room, 2 rooms away. But I heard it clearly, impossibly clearly. You can't save everyone. The same voice, the same perfect clarity, the same 5 words. The coffee pot slipped from my hand. I caught it before it hit the floor, but hot coffee splashed across my boots, soaking through the leather. I barely felt it. I was already moving, racing back to the day room to the radio. It sat silent on the charging dock. Screen dark. No active transmission. I grabbed it, keyed the mic. Dispatch Unit 47. Did you copy that last transmission? The response came back negative. No transmission logged. No open channels. Just the usual quiet night traffic. I set the radio down and stepped back from it like it was something dangerous, like it was something that might reach out and grab me. The clock showed 4:17 a.m., 43 minutes until shift change. 43 minutes until the day crew arrived, and I could leave this place, could go home and sleep, and convince myself that exhaustion and isolation had played tricks on my perception. That's when I noticed the smell. Subtle at first. So subtle I almost missed it under the usual station odors of cleaning solution and old coffee and the faint diesel tang that never quite left the ambulance bay. But it was there, growing stronger with each breath. Ozone, like after a lightning strike, like the air before a storm, and under that, something else. Something organic and wrong. The smell of a hospital room where someone had been sick for too long. The smell of human fear soaked into linoleum and plaster. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. The day room looked the same as always. Couch with its worn cushions, TV mounted on the wall, the desk with its scattered paperwork and cold coffee mugs. But something felt different. The proportions were wrong somehow. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. My vision swam. I pressed my palms against my eyes, counted to 10, looked again. Everything normal, everything in its place. The door alarm chimed. I didn't move this time. Didn't go to check the cameras or peer through the glass. I just stood there in the center of the day room while the alarm chimed again and again, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat, like something patient and persistent, testing the boundaries, learning the patterns. The radio crackled, not with a voice this time, but with that deep organic static. It rose and fell like breathing, like something massive drawing air in and out of ancient lungs. I should have run, should have grabbed my keys and walked out and kept walking until the sun came up and burned away whatever dark thing had settled over Station 47. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, listening to that breathing static, watching the door alarm's light blink red in perfect time with my pulse. Somewhere in the back of my mind, the voice whispered again, though the radio stayed silent. You can't save everyone. And I understood then what it really meant. Not a statement about the job, not about the patience we lost despite our best efforts. It was about me. You can't save everyone, not even yourself. The static stopped. The door alarm went silent. The station settled back into its normal hum and buzz and tick. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that first hint of gray that precedes dawn. I heard footsteps in the parking lot, car doors slamming, voices. The day crew arriving, their presence pushing back the darkness, making everything normal again. They found me standing in the day room, just standing there, asked if I was okay, said I looked pale. I told them I was fine, just a long shift, just tired. The words came out smooth and easy, like I'd practiced them. I gathered my things, punched out, walked to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying no trace of that wrong smell. The station looked ordinary in the growing light, just another municipal building squatting on its concrete pad. I sat in my car for a long time before I could make myself turn the key, looking at Station 47 through my windshield, watching the day crew move around inside, visible through the windows, going about their routines. Everything normal. Everything fine. I drove home, went to bed, stared at the ceiling while sunrise painted my bedroom walls gold. Tonight I go back for another shift. Same station, same chair, same radio sitting on its charging dock. And I know, the way you know things in the hollow of your chest where reason doesn't reach, that the alarm will chime again, that the voice will speak again, that some nights the thing you can't save is yourself. But I'll go anyway, because that's what we do. We show up. We wait for the call. We respond to the emergency, no matter what shape it takes. Even when the emergency is us. Even when the voice on the radio knows our names. Even when we can't be sure anymore what's waiting on the other side of that door when the alarm chimes and nobody's there. I'll go back. I always go back. And maybe that's the real horror. Not what's happening to me, but the fact that I can't stop, can't walk away, can't save myself from whatever is slowly wrapping its fingers around Station 47. You can't save everyone, but God help me, I keep trying. Story 6. The first explosion came at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake for hours, watching the ceiling fan carve lazy circles through the humid Brazilian night, counting the rotations like sheep I could never catch. When the sound hit, a percussion that seemed to originate from somewhere deep below the earth before erupting into the sky, the entire house shuddered. Picture frames rattled against bedroom walls. The water in the glass on my nightstand formed concentric rings that spread outward, outward, outward. My wife stirred beside me, her breathing pattern disrupted but not broken. She'd always been a heavy sleeper, blessed with the kind of oblivion I'd forgotten decades ago. I envied her that darkness, that total surrender to unconsciousness. I waited for the second boom, muscles tensed, but it didn't come. Not then. The silence that followed felt manufactured, too complete, as if something had pressed mute on the nocturnal symphony of insects and frogs that usually filled our nights here on the fazenda. Even the dogs, 3 mutts we'd inherited with the property, had gone quiet. Through the window I could see their silhouettes in the yard, perfectly still, facing the tree line that marked the edge of our property. and the beginning of the old quarry. Sleep became impossible after that. I rose in the pre-dawn gray and made coffee, watching the sky lighten in gradual degrees over the eucalyptus plantation we'd spent 3 years cultivating on this reclaimed land. The trees stood in perfect rows, tall and ghostly pale in the early light. Between them, shadows pooled thick as oil. My wife found me on the veranda an hour later, still holding the same cold cup of coffee. She asked if I'd heard anything unusual during the night. I told her about the sound, and she frowned, said she'd felt something but thought she'd been dreaming. Probably just thunder, she suggested. The rainy season was coming. I nodded and said nothing about the absence of clouds, the bone-dry air that made my skin feel like paper. The second explosion came 3 nights later, around the same time. This one was different. Not a single concussive blast, but a series of them, rhythmic and purposeful. Boom, 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 like massive footsteps approaching from the direction of the quarry. The house trembled with each impact. Dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. I counted 15 distinct blasts before they stopped. This time my wife woke fully, gripping my arm hard enough to leave marks. We lay there in the ringing silence, waiting. The dogs had started barking, frantic, hysterical sounds that seemed more terror than warning. Then, from somewhere beyond our property line came a noise that defied easy description. Imagine a jet engine starting up, that rising whine of turbines spooling into life. But wrong somehow. Too organic, too wet. It built and built until the windows vibrated in their frames and I had to cover my ears. The sound seemed to bypass my hands entirely, resonating directly in the bones of my skull. My wife was screaming something, but I couldn't hear her over the roar. Then it cut out. Instant silence. The dogs had stopped barking. Everything had stopped. We found them in the morning, all 3 dogs, arranged in a perfect line at the property's edge, sitting at attention, staring into the eucalyptus forest toward where the old quarry pit yawned somewhere in the darkness between the trees. They wouldn't come when called, wouldn't eat. Just sat and stared, their eyes fixed on something we couldn't see. I tried to convince my wife it was hunters illegally blasting in the hills beyond the quarry, some kind of mining operation, maybe sonic tests for underground water. She wanted to believe me. I could see it in her face, that desperate need for rational explanation. But when I suggested calling the authorities, she hesitated. What would we tell them? That we'd heard loud noises? That our dogs were acting strange? The third night, I stayed awake deliberately, positioned in a chair on the veranda with a flashlight and my grandfather's binoculars. The air felt different as midnight approached, charged somehow, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The dogs had finally come in from the tree line but wouldn't settle. They paced the house in circuits, their nails clicking against the tile floors in patterns that sounded almost like Morse code. 3:47 a.m. arrived like an appointment I'd been dreading. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep toward the hour, and exactly on time, the night convulsed. This explosion was different again. Multiple points of detonation, scattered throughout the forest, creating a symphony of percussion that built in complexity and volume. Through the binoculars, I could see flashes of light between the eucalyptus trunks. Not the orange-yellow of fire, but something blue-white and cold. The light moved. It pulsed in rhythm with the explosions, which weren't explosions at all, I realized. They were something mimicking explosions, something trying to sound like what we expected earthbound phenomena to sound like, but getting the details wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Then came the roar. Jet engines. Yes, but also something like a whale song run through a distortion pedal and played at window-shattering volume. The sound had texture. I could feel it pressing against my skin, could taste copper in the back of my throat. The trees bent away from invisible pressure. Birds erupted from the canopy in panicked clouds, scattering in all directions. I must have stood up. I don't remember doing it, but suddenly I was at the edge of the veranda, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding the binoculars to my eyes so tightly my hands ached. The lights were moving through the forest in patterns, geometric, deliberate, searching. And there, at the forest's edge, Something huge displaced the shadows, something that reflected the strange light in ways that made my eyes hurt, that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing into any coherent shape. My wife's hand on my shoulder nearly made me jump off the veranda. She'd come out without me noticing, and she was seeing it too. I could tell by her face, by the way her mouth hung open and her eyes had gone wide and liquid. She spoke, but I couldn't hear her over the roar. Her lips formed a question. "What is that?" I didn't have an answer. The thing at the tree line moved, and my perception skipped like a scratched record. One moment it was there, massive and wrong, and the next it had shifted position without appearing to cross the intervening space. The lights intensified. The roar doubled, tripled, became physical force that knocked us both back a step. Then silence, complete and total. The absence of sound was more shocking than its presence had been. The lights were gone. The thing, whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen, was gone. The forest stood perfectly still, perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. Even the birds had stopped fleeing. Everything had reset, like someone had pressed play after a pause. My wife and I stood on the veranda for the rest of the night, neither of us capable of speech, neither of us willing to acknowledge what we'd witnessed. When dawn came, it felt less like salvation and more like reprieve. Temporary, conditional. The dogs were gone. We searched the property, called until our voices went hoarse, walked the perimeter twice. They'd vanished sometime during the night, leaving no trace. At the tree line, we found 3 sets of paw prints in the soft earth, leading into the forest. The tracks were pressed so deeply into the ground they looked like the dogs had been carrying enormous weight. 50 feet in, the prints simply stopped. Not faded, not scattered. They ended mid-stride, as if the animals had been plucked from the earth by something above. We didn't speak about calling the police anymore. We didn't speak much at all. I started driving into town more often, finding excuses to leave the property during the day. Hardware stores, supply runs, visiting the small cafe where locals gathered to share gossip and coffee. I asked around, carefully, about strange sounds at night, about the history of the quarry. The responses I got were uniform in their evasiveness. Shrugs, subject changes, eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine. One old man, deep into his 3rd cachaça at 2 in the afternoon, leaned close and told me some places wanted to be left alone. Some holes in the earth went down a long way, he said, and you never knew what you might wake up when you started filling them with living things. I stopped asking questions after that. The phenomena continued, following their inexplicable schedule. Every few nights around the same time, the explosions and the roar. Sometimes I watched. Sometimes I hid in our bedroom with pillows pressed over my ears while my wife did the same beside me. The eucalyptus trees nearest the quarry began to die, their bark splitting and weeping sap that looked black in the moonlight. The die-off spread in rings, concentric circles that expanded nightly from some epicenter I couldn't pinpoint. I considered leaving. We both did, though we never said it aloud. But where would we go? And how would we explain abandoning a property we'd sunk our savings into, a dream we'd chased across continents? Who would believe us? More importantly, who would buy a farm where something incomprehensible announced its presence with mathematical regularity, where the trees were dying from the inside out, where the local population treated your questions like invitations to personal catastrophe? The rational explanations I'd clung to in those first days, military exercises, geological activity, elaborate pranks, had been eroded by repetition, by the accumulating weight of impossible details, the lights that moved with purpose, the sounds that felt deliberately wrong, the way reality seemed to skip and stutter when the phenomena reached their peak, the dogs that vanished into thin air. I began to notice other things, small details that might have been paranoia or might have been evidence of something worse. The way my watch would lose exactly 7 minutes during each event. The photographs we'd taken of the property that showed strange distortions in the tree line, smears of shadow that didn't correspond to any physical object, or occasionally what looked like massive shapes caught mid-motion, too blurred to identify but undeniably there. The dreams I'd started having, Though calling them dreams felt wrong, they were more like transmissions, like someone else's thoughts broadcast directly into my sleeping brain. Images of vast spaces underground, of machinery older than continents, of purposes I couldn't comprehend operating on timescales that made human lives look like firefly flashes. My wife started sleeping in the guest room. She said it was cooler there, farther from the side of the house facing the quarry, but I knew better. I could see the fear in her eyes when she looked at me, see her cataloging changes in my behavior, my appearance. I'd lost weight, stopped shaving regularly, spent too much time staring at the tree line, waiting for 3:47 a.m. like it was an appointment with destiny. She thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. Maybe I had been for weeks now. How would I know the difference between madness and impossible truth? How could anyone? Last night, though it feels like years ago, like time has become negotiable, I woke to find myself standing at the property's edge. I had no memory of leaving the house, no sense of how long I'd been there. The grass was wet with dew, and my bare feet had gone numb with cold. Ahead of me, the eucalyptus forest stood like a wall of pallid sentinels, their leaves rustling in wind I couldn't feel. My watch read 3:47 a.m. The explosion, when it came, erupted from directly beneath my feet. The ground split, a hairline fracture that spread in both directions, dividing the world into before and after. Light poured up from the crack, that same blue-white, cold and ancient and utterly wrong. The roar built, but this time it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from below, from the quarry pit we'd filled with soil and hope and rows of fast-growing trees. From whatever lay beneath the quarry, in depths the excavation had never reached. The light intensified until it was all I could see, until my shadow stretched 40 feet behind me, sharp and black against the house, and in that light, I saw them, shapes ascending from below, too many to count, too complex to comprehend. They moved through the earth like it was water, like physical law was a suggestion they'd chosen to ignore. They were heading for the surface, for the forest, for the farm, for everywhere. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee, to grab my wife and drive until the gas ran out and then keep running. But I couldn't move. I was rooted there, watching as the things rose from the depths we'd disturbed, from the pit we'd presumed to reclaim, from the darkness we'd tried to cover with something as fragile and temporary as trees. The ground trembled, the house shook, and somewhere behind me, I heard my wife calling my name, her voice small and distant and already belonging to a world that was ending. The light went out, the sound cut off. The crack in the earth sealed itself like a wound closing. I stood in the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. Nothing moved. The forest was silent. The sky had clouded over without me noticing, blocking out the stars. In the distance, so far away it might have been imagination, I heard something that could have been thunder, or could have been footsteps. Approaching or retreating, I couldn't tell. My wife's voice came again, closer now, urgent and afraid. She was asking what I was doing out here, why I'd left the house, whether I was all right. I wanted to answer, wanted to turn around and see her face and explain everything I'd witnessed, everything I'd understood in that moment of terrible illumination. But the words wouldn't come. They felt inadequate, like trying to describe color to the blind, or explain infinity to the dying. Because I knew now, understood what we'd done by building here, by covering the quarry with foreign trees, by filling the hollow places with our presence and our noise and our presumption. We'd woken something, or maybe we'd buried something that was already awake. Maybe the difference didn't matter. The explosions would continue. The roar would come again and again, regular as a heartbeat, inevitable as entropy. And one night, maybe tonight, maybe years from now, something would finally break through. Or maybe it already had, and we just hadn't noticed yet. Maybe the change had already happened, subtle and complete. And the world we thought we knew was just a memory we were collectively agreeing to pretend was real. I turned to face my wife, and in the moment before my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I couldn't quite remember what she was supposed to look like. couldn't quite recall if the shape standing behind me was the right size, the right configuration of limbs and proportions. The uncertainty passed in an instant, and there she was, exactly as she should be, her face creased with worry, her hand reaching for mine. But that moment of doubt, that single instant of not knowing, would never leave me. We walked back to the house together, and neither of us mentioned the crack that had opened in the earth, which had already grassed over as if it had never existed. Neither of us acknowledged the way the eucalyptus trees had begun to sway despite the absence of any wind, their movements synchronized, purposeful, like they were breathing with lungs we couldn't see. The dogs never came back. The trees keep dying. The explosions continue their schedule with mechanical precision. And every night at 3:47 a.m. I wake to watch and wait, because someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to see what's coming, even if they can't stop it, can't explain it, can't do anything but stand at the edge of understanding and stare into the spaces between what we know and what refuses to be known. The quarry remembers what it was before we claimed it. The earth remembers what we tried to bury. And somewhere in the darkness beneath our feet, beneath our trees, beneath our dreams of taming the wild places, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman continues its work. I just wish I knew if we were the intruders or the invited. Story 7. The bowl sits 3 miles from any marked trail, cradled between ridges so steep they might as well be walls. I found it on the topographic map 2 weeks ago, studying the contour lines like a sermon, and something about its isolation called to me. The kind of place where the forest closes in, and you remember what it means to be alone. Really alone. I reached the spot just before dusk, legs burning from the descent, pack straps cutting grooves into my shoulders. The air down here felt different, heavier, older somehow. Massive oaks and hickories ringed the clearing, their trunks wider than my arms could reach. Bark so deeply furrowed it looked like petrified flesh. Moss hung from everything in gray-green curtains. The forest floor was a carpet of last year's leaves, ankle-deep and whispering with each step. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. My hands fumbled with tent stakes I'd driven 100 times before. Twice I had to rethread the poles because my attention kept drifting to the tree line, to the spaces between those ancient trunks where the shadows were already pooling thick. The light was fading fast, that peculiar mountain twilight where everything goes blue-gray and distances become impossible to judge. I got a fire going as darkness settled in completely. The flames pushed back the night maybe 10 feet, and beyond that, there was nothing but black. Not the comfortable darkness of a suburban backyard or even a regular campsite. This was the kind of dark that had weight, that pressed against the firelight like something physical. I could feel it on my skin. The sound started normal enough. A barred owl called from somewhere up the eastern ridge, that distinctive 8-note hoot that always sounds like it's asking a question. Wind moved through the canopy high above, making the trees creak and sway. Small things rustled in the leaf litter, probably mice or voles going about their nocturnal business. I ate my dehydrated meal straight from the bag and tried to relax into the solitude I'd been craving for months. That's when I heard the first knock. It came from the western ridge, maybe a quarter-mile away. A single impact, deep and resonant, like someone had struck a tree trunk with a baseball bat, but bigger, much bigger. The sound rolled down the slope and across the bowl, and I felt it in my chest as much as I heard it. I stopped chewing and stared up toward where I thought the sound had originated, but there was nothing to see. Just that wall of darkness beyond the firelight, impenetrable and vast. Probably a dead tree finally giving way, I told myself. Branches falling. Something natural and explainable. The forest was full of sounds, especially at night. I'd been camping alone for years. This was nothing, but my heart had already started beating faster. I forced myself to finish eating, to go through the ritual of hanging my food bag from a high branch, to brush my teeth and rinse my mouth with water that tasted like plastic and iodine. The fire had burned down to coals, and I was considering whether to build it back up or just retreat to my tent when the second knock came. Same direction, same deep, hollow sound. But this one was answered. From the eastern ridge, where the owl had been calling earlier, came a responding knock. 3 distinct beats, evenly spaced. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Each one deliberate and powerful, the kind of impact that suggested immense force behind it. The sound echoed in the bowl, bouncing off the slopes, and for a moment it felt like the entire forest was a resonating chamber built to amplify that terrible rhythm. I stood frozen by the fire pit, every muscle tensed. My rational mind was scrambling for explanations. Hunters? But nobody hunted at night, and certainly not by banging on trees. Other campers? I hadn't seen any sign of human presence in the hours of hiking it had taken to reach this place. The Forest Service maps showed this area as remote backcountry, rarely visited. The silence that followed was worse than the knocks. It felt expectant, waiting. I realized I'd been holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly. The fire popped, sending up a small shower of sparks, and I jumped like I'd been shot. I needed to think, to assess the situation logically. But logic felt slippery down here in the dark, hard to hold on to. My hands were shaking as I added more wood to the fire, building it higher than was wise, feeding it until the flames leapt 4 feet tall and threw dancing shadows across the clearing. The light reached farther now, but somehow that made it worse. I could see the trees at the edge of the firelight, massive and impassive, and the darkness beyond them seemed to have grown denser, more solid. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20. Time had gotten strange. I couldn't make myself go into the tent, couldn't turn my back on the forest. So I sat on a log by the fire and waited, every sense straining against the night. When the third set of knocks came, they were closer. Much closer. They came from the southern slope, no more than 100 yards away. 3 impacts again. That same deliberate rhythm. Thunk, thunk, thunk. But now I could hear something else beneath the sound. A kind of reverberation. A quality that suggested the thing making the noise was massive beyond belief. Each knock seemed to shake the ground beneath me, a subsonic pulse I felt in my bones. And they were answered. From the north, from the west, from the east. One by one, positions around the bowl responded. 3 knocks each, perfectly spaced, a call and response that surrounded me completely. The sound echoed and overlapped until I couldn't tell anymore where one ended and another began. The entire forest seemed to be knocking, beating out some ancient rhythm I wasn't meant to hear. I grabbed my flashlight with hands that no longer felt like my own, and swept the beam across the tree line. The light seemed pathetically weak, swallowed almost immediately by the dark. It caught nothing but trees and shadows, and the slow drift of mist that had begun to gather in the low places. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. Before, the night had been full of small sounds. Insects, wind, the settling of the forest. Now there was nothing. Even the owl had gone quiet. It was as if every living thing except me had fled or was holding its breath. I should leave, I thought. Pack up right now and hike out. But the rational part of my brain, the part that was rapidly losing ground, knew how insane that was. 3 miles of steep, rough terrain in complete darkness, probably breaking an ankle or walking off a cliff in the first half mile. And something about the idea of being out there on the trail, alone in the trees with whatever was making those sounds, was infinitely worse than staying put. The fire. I had the fire. Nothing would come near the fire. I believed that for maybe another hour. I sat feeding wood to the flames, going through my supply faster than I should, unable to stop myself. The heat was intense, making my face feel tight and sunburned, but my back was cold. So cold. And I kept feeling like something was behind me, just outside the circle of light, watching. Several times I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, finding nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. Just the mist thickening along the ground like something living. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Wood knocks. The term surfaced from somewhere in my memory. Late-night internet rabbit holes. cryptid forums I'd browsed half-ironically. People claimed Bigfoot communicated that way, striking trees to signal across distances. But that was bullshit. Campfire stories. There was no such thing. There had to be another explanation. Except I couldn't think of one. The knocking started again around what must have been midnight, though I'd lost track of time. I'd been staring into the fire, watching the flames until my eyes burned. When the first impact came from so close, I actually felt the vibration through the ground. It was behind me. I wheeled around, flashlight beam jerking wildly, and for just a second, maybe less, I thought I saw something. A shape between the trees, enormous and upright. There and then gone so fast I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. My light caught only bark and leaves and that cursed mist. But something had moved. I was certain of it. The knocking came faster now, from all directions, no longer following any rhythm I could discern. Random bursts of sound that made me spin and stumble, trying to track the source, the flashlight beam cutting useless arcs through the darkness. My breath was coming in short gasps. My legs felt weak. They're surrounding me, I thought, closing in, but there was no they. There couldn't be. I was alone. I had to be alone. I backed toward the tent, keeping the fire between me and the tree line, and that's when I realized I could smell something. A thick, musky odor, like wet dog and rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. It was strong enough to taste, and it was getting stronger. The rational part of my mind, that small, shrinking voice, said it was just the woods. Decomposition. Natural processes. But decomposition didn't move, didn't circle, didn't coordinate. I scrambled into my tent and zipped it shut with shaking hands, as if a thin layer of nylon could protect me from anything. The fabric walls glowed orange from the firelight outside, throwing distorted shadows. I could see the silhouettes of trees swaying. Or maybe they weren't swaying. Maybe they were moving. Stop it, I told myself. Get control. You're panicking, making yourself crazy. But the knocking continued, and now I could hear something else. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my camp. Not the soft pat of a deer or the shuffle of a bear. These were bipedal, I was somehow certain. Two-footed strides that crunched through the leaf litter with weight that spoke of immense mass. The smell was overwhelming now, seeping into the tent, making my eyes water. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched to my chest, listening to whatever was out there move through my camp. I heard my pack being moved, the scrape of metal on metal. The food bag I'd hung. I heard the rope creak as something pulled on it, but I didn't hear any vocalizations. No breathing, no growls or grunts. Just those footsteps and the knocking that had become almost constant, like a grotesque percussion echoing from every direction. The fire must have burned low because the glow through the tent walls began to dim. As the light faded, the footsteps grew closer. I could track them by sound alone. Here at the edge of the clearing, now passing behind the tent, now in front. Circling, always circling. Something brushed against the tent wall near my head. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The fabric pushed inward slightly, as if something was pressing against it from outside, feeling the contours, testing. I stared at the bulge, watching it move slowly downward, a pressure that suggested fingers, though I couldn't see any detail through the nylon. Then it was gone. The footsteps retreated. The knocking stopped. And for a long moment, there was only silence and darkness, and the ragged sound of my own breathing. I stayed like that, curled in my sleeping bag, flashlight in a death grip, until dawn. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape between the trees, felt that pressure against the tent wall. When gray light finally began to seep through the fabric, I nearly sobbed with relief. But when I emerged from the tent, my camp was undisturbed. The fire had burned down to cold ash. My pack sat where I'd left it. The food bag still hung from its branch, untouched. There were no tracks in the soft earth around my tent. No sign that anything had been there at all. I packed with trembling hands and started the climb out of the bowl as the sun rose over the eastern ridge. My legs felt weak, unsteady. The 3 miles back to the trailhead seemed to take forever, and with every step I fought the urge to run. When I finally reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I've been home for 3 days now. 3 days of trying to convince myself it was my imagination, sleep deprivation, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Maybe some hikers had been up on the ridges, coincidentally camping nearby, and the sounds had carried strangely in the bowl. Maybe I'd been half asleep and dreaming. Maybe the stress I'd been trying to escape had followed me into the woods and manifested as something else entirely. But last night, lying in my bed in my suburban apartment with locked doors and streetlights bleeding through the curtains, I heard it. Distant but unmistakable. 3 knocks. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been circling my camp that night had followed me home. Or maybe it had always been here, and I'd only learned to hear it in that bowl between the ridges, where the darkness is old and the silence knows your name. I've stopped sleeping. I sit by the window now, watching the trees at the edge of the parking lot, waiting, listening. Because sometimes, when the wind dies down and the city goes quiet, I can smell it, and the knocking is getting closer. Story 8. The steel beneath my boots hummed with a frequency I'd felt before, in other places, other times. USS Sterrett cut through the Pacific darkness like a blade through silk, and I stood on the weather deck watching phosphorescence trail behind us, those strange glowing organisms churning in our wake. 23 days at sea, and the thing I'd spent my whole life running from had finally caught up with me. I'd seen my first ghost when I was 7, a woman in my grandmother's house who stood at the top of the stairs, her face turned toward the wall. Then the shadow figure in my college dorm that would crouch in the corner of my room, watching me sleep until I'd force myself awake, heart hammering. The apartment in San Diego, where I'd hear footsteps pacing the hallway at 3 a.m., always stopping outside my door. I'd learned to live with it, this sensitivity to whatever existed in the spaces between, but I'd never told anyone. Who would believe me? Who would want to serve with someone who saw things that weren't there? The Navy had seemed like an escape, movement, purpose, the vast emptiness of the ocean where surely nothing could linger. But the Sterrett had its own darkness, and it had been waiting for someone like me. It started in the passageways during the midwatch. I'd be making my rounds, the ship sleeping around me, except for the skeleton crew keeping us alive and moving. The overhead lights would flicker, just for a moment, and in that brief darkness, I'd catch movement at the edge of my vision. A figure rounding a corner, disappearing through a hatch that I'd reach seconds later to find sealed and dogged down, the wheel stiff with disuse. Petty Officer Chambers noticed me checking the hatches obsessively during our second week out. He was older than most of us, graying at the temples, with the kind of weathered face that had seen too many deployments. He'd pulled me aside in the mess deck, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear over the clatter of trays and the ever-present hum of the ship's ventilation. The way he told it, there had been another sailor 3 years back. Chambers wouldn't give me the name, said it was bad luck to speak it aloud on the ship, but he described a young guy, couldn't have been more than 22, who'd been stationed down in the engineering spaces. Something had happened. Chambers got vague here, his eyes sliding away from mine, and they'd found him in one of the voids, those empty spaces between the hull where maintenance crews rarely went. The official report said equipment malfunction, but Chambers leaned in close when he said this, and I could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with something else, something like fear. Since then, people had seen things, always in the same places, the forward berthing area, the main engineering space, and the passageway outside the ship's office. Chambers said the guy had walked that route every day during his watch, and now something still did. I wanted to dismiss it as ship legend, the kind of story sailors tell to break up the monotony of deployment. But that night, during my watch, I saw the face. I was doing a sweep of the forward berthing, checking that all the racks were occupied and accounted for. The compartment was dim, lit only by the red night lights that wouldn't destroy our night vision. Rows of bunks stacked 3 high, each one a coffin-sized space where men slept pressed against bulkheads of steel. The air was thick with the smell of bodies and laundry detergent, the sound of breathing, and the occasional snore cutting through the mechanical white noise of the ventilation system. That's when I felt it. The sensation of being watched, not the casual awareness of being in a room with others, but something focused, intent. I turned slowly, scanning the berthing area, and there, in the shadows between 2 sets of bunks, I saw it. A face, pale as bone, staring at me with eyes that caught and held the red light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. It wasn't hiding exactly, but it wasn't fully present either, like looking at someone through layers of gauze. My breath stopped in my chest. I'd seen apparitions before, but never like this. Never so clear, never so aware of me. The face didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it curiosity? Anger? Loneliness? I wanted to call out, to wake someone, but my voice had frozen in my throat. The moment stretched, seconds feeling like minutes, and then someone shifted in their rack, mumbling in their sleep, and the face was gone. Just empty space and shadow where it had been. I finished my rounds on autopilot, my hands shaking as I filled out the log. I didn't report what I'd seen. What would I say? That I'd seen a ghost? That the dead sailor was real and watching us from the darkness? But after that night, I couldn't unsee it. The face appeared again and again, always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. In the reflection of the polished steel doors, in the shadows of the machinery spaces. Once, I swore I saw it looking up at me from the dark water we were cutting through, its pale face breaking the surface for just a moment before sliding back beneath the waves. The worst part was the certainty that it knew I could see it. The others noticed my deteriorating state. I wasn't sleeping well. How could I, knowing that face might appear in the berthing area at any moment? I'd taken to volunteering for extra watches, anything to avoid lying in my rack in the darkness. My hands shook during routine tasks. I jumped at sudden sounds. Lieutenant Reeves pulled me aside and suggested I talk to the ship's counselor, but I knew I couldn't tell the truth. They'd think I was losing it. Maybe I was. 3 weeks into deployment, I started seeing the full figure. It was during a storm, the ship pitching and rolling in heavy seas. I was making my way aft, one hand on the bulkhead for stability, when I saw him ahead of me in the passageway. A sailor in working uniform, his back to me, standing perfectly still despite the ship's violent motion. There was something wrong about the way he stood, too rigid, like a mannequin arranged in place. I called out, my voice barely audible over the storm. The figure didn't respond, didn't turn. I moved closer, fighting the ship's roll, and as I did, the overhead lights flickered, that same brief moment of darkness, and when they came back on, the figure was closer to me, though I hadn't seen it move. Still facing away, still impossibly still. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to go back the way I came, but my watch route took me aft, and pride or stubbornness or something else pushed me forward. I had to pass him. I had to walk by whatever this was. As I drew level with the figure, I could see him more clearly in my peripheral vision. The uniform was wrong, not quite the right color, and there was something off about the proportions, like looking at a photograph that had been slightly distorted. But I couldn't look at him directly. Some primitive part of my brain refused to let me turn my head, as if direct eye contact would be an invitation I couldn't take back. I passed him, my shoulder almost brushing his, and the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath mist in the air. The smell hit me then. Salt water and rust and something else, something organic and wrong. I forced myself to keep walking, to not run, though every muscle in my body was tensed for flight. When I reached the next hatch and spun the wheel to open it, I couldn't help but glance back. The passageway was empty. Nothing but steel and shadow and the red emergency lights casting everything in a hellish glow. I went to chambers the next day. I had to talk to someone. Consequences be damned. We met in one of the storage spaces surrounded by boxes of supplies and spare parts, the only place on the ship where we could be relatively alone. When I told him what I'd been seeing, he didn't look surprised. His face just got grayer, older, and he sat down heavily on a crate of tools. He told me more of the story then, filling in the gaps he'd left before. The sailor hadn't just been found in the void. He'd been down there for 2 days before they located him, and when they did, he'd been standing in a space too small to stand in, his body bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. The investigation had ruled it an accident, but Chambers had been part of the team that found him, and he'd seen the expression on the dead man's face. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, like he'd been expecting something, and it had finally arrived. Since then, Chambers said, 3 other sailors had requested transfers off the Sterret after experiencing what I was going through. The Navy didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but they'd approved the transfers quietly, without asking too many questions. Smart captains knew that superstition was its own kind of reality on a ship, but we were 3 weeks from port, and there was nowhere for me to go. That night, I dreamed of drowning, not unusual on a ship, where we all slept below the waterline, surrounded by the ocean that could kill us in minutes if the hull breached. But in this dream, I wasn't drowning in water. I was drowning in a crowd of faces, dozens of them, all pale and staring, all pressing against me with the cold pressure of deep water. And at the center of them all was him, the sailor, his mouth open in a silent scream or laugh or accusation. I woke gasping, tangled in my sheets, and the first thing I saw was the face hovering above my rack, closer than it had ever been, near enough that I could have reached up and touched it if I'd had the courage. This time I could see details I'd been spared before. The gray pallor of the skin, the strange flatness of the eyes, the way the edges seemed to blur and solidify like something seen through heat shimmer. And then it spoke, not with sound exactly, but directly into my head, bypassing my ears entirely. Just one word, repeated with the rhythm of a heartbeat or the ship's engines. Sea, sea, sea. I scrambled out of my rack, not caring about the noise I made, not caring who I woke. I ran from the berthing area, my bare feet slapping against the cold deck, and I didn't stop until I reached the weather deck, bursting through the hatch into the open air. The ocean stretched around us in all directions, black and empty under a moonless sky. The wind cut through my thin shirt, raising gooseflesh on my arms, but I welcomed the cold, the reality of it. Out here, under the vast indifference of the sky, the claustrophobic horror of the interior spaces felt distant, manageable. I wasn't alone on deck. A small group had gathered at the rail, and I recognized some of them from my division. They were looking at something in the water, pointing, their voices low and urgent. I approached slowly, drawn despite myself. In the water beside the ship, keeping pace with us despite our speed, were lights. Not the phosphorescence I'd seen before, but distinct points of illumination, dozens of them, moving in formation beneath the surface. And as I watched, as we all watched, the lights began to rise. They weren't lights. They were faces. Pale faces, identical to the one I'd been seeing, all of them staring up at us from the depths. They floated just below the surface, a crowd of them, a school of them, their eyes tracking the ship's movement with an intelligence that made my stomach turn. One of the sailors next to me said something about bioluminescence, about rare deep-sea organisms, but his voice was shaking and no one believed him. We all knew what we were seeing, even if we couldn't name it. The ocean had given up its dead, or shown us what had always been there, and we were seeing it through the eyes of someone who couldn't look away. Then the faces began to sink, descending back into the darkness one by one, until only a single one remained. The sailor. My sailor. He hung there in the water, suspended, and for the first time since this had all started, I looked at him directly. Really looked. He looked back, and in that moment of connection, I understood. The haunting had never been about this ship, this sailor, this story Chambers had told me. It had been about me. It had always been about me. Every ghost I'd seen, every spirit that had followed me from house to house, place to place, they weren't separate entities. They were all the same thing, wearing different faces, and it had been patient. It had waited my entire life for me to end up here, on this ship, in the middle of the ocean where there was nowhere to run. The face in the water smiled, the first expression I'd seen it make, and then it was gone, sinking into depths that would crush human bones to powder. I stood at the rail long after the others had left, staring at the black water, and I knew with certainty that when we returned to port, I wouldn't request a transfer. There was no point. Whatever this was, it had claimed me long before I stepped aboard the Sterret. The ship was just where it had finally decided to make itself known. Chambers found me there as dawn began to gray the eastern horizon. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He just stood beside me, another old sailor who'd seen too much and understood that some things couldn't be escaped, only endured. We're 37 days out now. I've stopped trying to avoid the places where the sailor appears. I've accepted his presence the way you accept the constant noise of the ship's machinery, the roll of the deck beneath your feet, the smell of diesel and salt that never quite leaves your clothes. He's part of the Sterret now, part of me, part of whatever I've always been. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the midwatch, I wonder if I'm really here at all, if maybe I'm the ghost, haunting a ship that doesn't exist, seen by sailors who are just as lost as I am. The line between the living and the dead seems thinner out here, stretched across miles of empty ocean until it's transparent, permeable, meaningless. Tonight, I'll make my rounds as always. I'll check the berthing areas, the engineering spaces, the passageways where shadows collect in corners no light can reach. And if I see faces watching me from the darkness, if I feel that familiar presence just over my shoulder, I'll keep walking. I'll do my job. I'll serve my watch. Because what else is there to do when you finally realize that you've been haunted your whole life, and the haunting is the only thing that's ever really seen you? The ocean knows. The Sterret knows. And somewhere in the spaces between the bulkheads, in the voids where no one goes, the sailor knows too. We're all still here, together, waiting for something that may have already happened. Or maybe it's still coming. Maybe it's been coming all along. Story 9. They told me about the shower on my first night working maintenance at Brennan Hall. The women's dormitory had been built in the 60s, all concrete and institutional tile, and it carried that particular smell of old buildings, something between bleach and decay that no amount of cleaning could ever quite mask. The head custodian, a rail-thin man whose name I never caught, mentioned it almost as an afterthought while showing me where we kept the industrial cleaner. "Third floor, east wing," he said, not looking at me. "Last stall in the bathroom. Don't go in there after midnight." I laughed. He didn't. That was 3 weeks ago. I should have paid more attention. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. It's quiet work, mostly. Mopping floors, fixing the occasional clogged drain, replacing light bulbs in the long corridors that seem to stretch forever under the fluorescent glare. The students are usually asleep or keeping to themselves, and I've learned to move through the building like a ghost, my footsteps absorbed by the thick carpet in the hallways, my presence barely registered. But that third-floor bathroom had started bothering me almost immediately. Nothing I could put my finger on at first. Just a feeling that settled in my stomach whenever I passed it during my rounds. The door was always slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of white tile and the edge of a mirror that reflected nothing but darkness. The overhead lights seemed dimmer there, casting shadows that didn't quite match the fixtures. And there was a sound, so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining it. Water dripping, slow and rhythmic, even though I'd checked every faucet and found them all tightly shut. I mentioned it to my supervisor once. She looked at me with that same careful expression the head custodian had worn, then told me that if the bathroom bothered me, I could skip it in my rounds. The students would clean up after themselves, she said. They always did, in that particular bathroom. That should have been my second warning. It was a Thursday night when things changed. I remember because Thursdays are usually the quietest, the lull between midweek and weekend, when even the most dedicated partiers stay in their rooms. I'd finished the second floor and was heading up the east stairwell, my cart rattling behind me with its cargo of cleaning supplies and tools. The stairwell lights had been flickering all week, something wrong with the wiring that I'd meant to fix but kept putting off. In the stuttering illumination, my shadow stretched and contracted on the concrete walls like something trying to break free. The third-floor hallway was dark, except for the emergency exit signs, their red glow painting everything in shades of rust and blood. I'd noticed that more lights were out than usual. Had anyone else been working up here? But I was alone on the night shift, had been for months since the last guy quit without notice. The bathroom door stood open wider than I'd ever seen it. Not inviting exactly, but expectant. Waiting. I should have walked past. Should have remembered the warnings, the careful way people talked about this place, the fact that students apparently avoided it entirely, despite it being the only bathroom on the east wing. But I'd been hired to maintain this building, and that meant all of it, even the parts that made my skin crawl. The smell hit me first when I stepped inside, not the usual bathroom smell of industrial soap and tile cleaner, but something organic and wrong, sweet, almost, but with an undercurrent of rot that made my throat close. The fluorescent lights were working, but they hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache, and their glow seemed to pulse in time with something I could feel but not hear. 5 stalls lined the far wall, their green metal doors closed except for the last one, which stood open just enough to show the edge of a white porcelain toilet and the corner of a shower curtain that I didn't remember being there. The sinks along the opposite wall reflected my image back at me in segments, fractured by the spaces between mirrors, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw someone else standing behind me, a dark shape that vanished when I spun around to face empty air. The dripping sound was louder in here, echoing off the tile in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. 3 quick drops, then silence, then 3 more. Like Morse code. Like a message I couldn't quite decode. I moved toward the last stall, my footsteps too loud in the confined space. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, that this violated every horror movie rule ever written, but I was tired and irritated and determined to prove that there was nothing supernatural about a bathroom in a college dormitory. Just old pipes and older nerves. The stall door was cold when I touched it. Not bathroom cool, but genuinely cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you think of November graveyards and winter drownings. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges shrieking in protest, and stared at what lay beyond. The shower was running. Not just dripping, but actively running. Steam rising from the stall in thick coils that seemed to move with purpose, rather than simply dispersing into the air. The curtain, definitely not there before, I was certain now, was drawn closed, its surface beaded with condensation that caught the light in strange ways. And behind it, I could see a shadow. Someone was in there. Hello? My voice sounded hollow, eaten by the steam and the weird acoustics of the space. Sorry, I'm maintenance. Didn't know anyone was... The water cut off. Not gradually, not with the slow decrease of someone turning a handle, but instantly, as if someone had severed the pipe. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been, broken only by my own breathing and the rapid thud of my pulse in my ears. The shadow behind the curtain didn't move. It stood there, completely still, and I realized with a creeping sense of wrongness that it was facing me, watching me through the translucent plastic, though I couldn't make out any features, any indication of who or what it was. I took a step back, then another. The shadow didn't follow, but I felt its attention on me like a physical weight, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. The temperature in the bathroom had dropped, my breath now visible in small clouds, and that smell, that sweet rot smell, intensified until I had to fight not to gag. That's when I heard the door. Not the stall door, not the door I'd come through, but another door, somewhere in the impossible geography of that 5-stall bathroom, slamming shut with a force that shook the walls and sent the mirrors rattling in their fixtures. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through my skull, and in its wake I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming closer. I ran. There's no shame in admitting it. I abandoned my cart, my equipment, my pride, and I ran for the exit with my heart hammering and my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear those footsteps matching my pace, always exactly the same distance away no matter how fast I moved, and beneath them, a sound like fabric dragging across tile, or like something flowing and formless pulling itself along through sheer determination. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been. The exit sign that marked the stairwell glowed ahead of me, but it never seemed to get closer, and the walls on either side were wrong somehow. Too narrow or too tall, or at angles that shouldn't have been possible in a building that I'd walked through 100 times before. The carpet beneath my feet felt soft, almost liquid, and I had the horrible certainty that if I stopped moving, I would sink right through it into some space beneath the floor, where things waited in the dark. I made it to my office on the first floor and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and backing away until my shoulders hit the far wall. The footsteps stopped outside. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap beneath the door, two dark shapes that stood absolutely motionless. Waiting. It stayed there until morning. I know because I watched that gap for 8 straight hours, too terrified to move or call for help or do anything but stand there and stare, and try to convince myself that I was imagining things. The shadow never moved, never shifted, just stood there with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. When the first rays of sunlight came through the window above my desk, the shadow was gone. Just like that, between one blink and the next, as if it had never been there at all. I should have quit that day. Should have walked out and never come back. Found some other job where the worst thing I had to deal with was difficult customers or bad coffee. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the nagging certainty that if I left, someone else would take the job, and whatever was in that bathroom would be waiting for them instead. So I stay. I do my rounds. I fix what needs fixing. I mop the floors and replace the bulbs and pretend everything is normal. But I don't go into the third-floor bathroom anymore, especially not after midnight. And when I pass it during my rounds, I look straight ahead and walk quickly and try not to think about the shadow behind the shower curtain or the footsteps that paced outside my door, or the way the building sometimes seems to breathe around me in the dead of night. The students still avoid it. The other staff still talk about it in careful voices. And sometimes, when the building is quiet and I'm alone in the halls, I hear it. The sound of a door slamming, violent and sudden, followed by footsteps that echo from the floor above. I tell myself it's just pipes, just the building settling, just my imagination working overtime after too many late shifts and not enough sleep. But I don't believe it, and I don't think I ever will. Last week I found wet footprints leading from the third-floor bathroom down the stairs to my office. They were there when I arrived for my shift, still damp, trailing water that smelled of that same sweet rot. I mopped them up quickly, not thinking, just moving on autopilot. It wasn't until later that I realized the prints were facing the wrong direction. They weren't leading away from the bathroom. They were leading toward me. Story 10. The dispatch came through at 2:47 a.m., a time when the world feels thinner somehow, when the barrier between waking and dreaming grows permeable. Fire alarm activation at 1847 Ashford Lane, followed 30 seconds later by a 911 hang-up from the same address. I'd been a cop for 11 years, and that combination always meant something was wrong. People don't trigger their fire alarms and then call 911 for nothing, and they certainly don't hang up unless something prevents them from speaking. The November rain had turned the streets into mirrors, reflecting the strobing lights of my cruiser as I pulled up to the house. It was a craftsman-style home, probably built in the 30s, with that particular kind of dignity that old houses have when they've been well maintained. The porch light was on, casting a weak yellow glow that seemed to struggle against the darkness pressing in from all sides. No smoke visible, no flames, but the front door stood slightly ajar, just enough to suggest invitation or warning, I couldn't tell which. I radioed my position and approached with my flashlight cutting through the rain. The dispatch operator's voice crackled back with information I hadn't requested. The homeowner was a woman named Evelyn Pritchard, age 73, widow of Fire Chief Thomas Pritchard, who'd served the department for 42 years before his death 15 years ago. Their son, Robert Pritchard, had also been fire chief until his retirement just last month. The operator's voice carried an odd weight when she mentioned that Robert still lived here with his mother, as if this fact meant something I should understand. The smell hit me the moment I reached the doorway. Natural gas, unmistakable and thick enough to make my eyes water. I keyed my radio immediately, requesting fire and ambulance, then called out as loudly as I dared without creating a spark of sound that might somehow ignite the air itself. No response came from inside. I should have waited for the fire department. Protocol demanded it, but the 911 call suggested someone inside might be incapacitated, might be dying from gas inhalation or worse. I made the decision in a heartbeat, though it would haunt me far longer than a heartbeat lasts. The interior was pristine in the way that only obsessively maintained homes can be. Everything had its place. Every surface gleamed even in my flashlight's beam, and the walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. As I moved through the foyer toward where I thought the kitchen might be, my light caught the faces in those frames. Firefighters, all of them. Some photos were sepia-toned and ancient, showing men with handlebar mustaches standing beside horse-drawn steam engines. Others were more recent, color photographs of men in modern turnout gear, but the resemblance between all of them was striking. The Pritchard family line, I assumed, stretching back generations, all dedicated to fighting fire. The gas smell intensified as I moved deeper into the house. It seemed to pulse with my heartbeat, growing stronger and weaker in rhythm with my pulse. I called out again, my voice sounding muffled and strange in the thick air, as if the gas were swallowing my words before they could travel far. I found the old woman in the living room, slumped in a leather recliner that had molded itself to her body over countless years. She wasn't moving, and for a terrible moment I thought I was too late. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. I moved toward her, intending to carry her outside before the house became a bomb, but something made me pause. Her eyes were open. They tracked my movement with perfect awareness, following me as I approached, but her body remained absolutely still. Not the stillness of unconsciousness or weakness, but something more deliberate, as if she were holding herself in place through sheer will. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and I leaned closer despite every instinct screaming at me to grab her and run. She was counting, over and over, the same numbers, 17, 18, 47, then again, 17, 18, 47. Her voice was barely a whisper, each repetition identical to the last, mechanical in its precision. The address. She was reciting the house number, 1847, Ashford Lane. A door slammed somewhere upstairs, the sound sharp enough to make me spin around, my hand dropping to my weapon before I realized the absurdity of drawing a gun in a house full of gas. I shouted up the stairs, identifying myself, demanding whoever was there to make themselves known. The only response was the settling of the house, the kind of creaks and groans that old homes make, except these sounded almost like footsteps retreating down a hallway I couldn't see. Robert Pritchard had to be up there. The son, the retired fire chief. I called his name, got nothing back, and made another decision I questioned later. I started up the stairs, leaving his mother in her chair, still counting those numbers with mechanical precision. The second floor was darker somehow, as if the shadows here were denser, more resistant to my flashlight's beam. More photographs lined the hallway, but these were different. They showed fire scenes, buildings engulfed in flame, firefighters directing streams of water, the organized chaos of emergency response. But something about them felt wrong. The longer I looked, the more I realized the fires in these pictures seemed to be burning backward, the flames pulling inward rather than reaching out, as if these weren't photographs of fires being fought, but fires being summoned wasn't the right word, but it was close. I found Robert Pritchard in what must have been his father's old study. He sat at a massive oak desk, wearing his dress uniform despite the late hour, every button polished, every crease sharp. His chief's hat sat perfectly centered on the desk before him, flanked by two ancient brass speaking trumpets, the kind fire chiefs used before radio communication existed. He was writing something in a leather-bound journal, his hand moving with steady purpose, and he didn't look up when I entered. The gas smell was overwhelming here, so thick I could taste it, metallic and wrong on my tongue. I could feel it filling my lungs, displacing oxygen, making my thoughts slow and sticky. I called his name, told him we needed to evacuate immediately, that his mother needed help, that the house was in danger. He kept writing. I approached the desk, close enough now to see what he was writing. The same words, over and over again, filling page after page. They called us back. They called us back. They called us back. The handwriting was immaculate. Each letter formed with the precision of a draftsman, even though his hand never stopped moving, never paused, as if he were a machine built for this single purpose. Behind him, the wall held more photographs, but these made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't immediately explain. They showed fire chiefs going back over a century, each identified with a nameplate. Thomas Pritchard, 1960-2010. Walter Pritchard, 1935-1978. Edmund Pritchard, 1902-1951. The lineage continued backward to the 1870s, an unbroken chain of Pritchards serving as fire chief, and every single one of them was staring directly at the camera with the exact same expression. Not quite smiling, not quite serious, but something in between that suggested they knew something the viewer didn't. That's when I noticed the dates. All of them had died in November. Every single chief, across more than a century, had died in November. And more than that, I looked closer, squinting in the dim light. They'd all died on the same day, November 17th. Today was November 17th. The sound of breaking glass came from downstairs, followed by a rush of air that made the gas smell surge even stronger. My radio crackled with static, then fell silent, as if the battery had died, though I'd replaced it just that morning. I heard the fire trucks arriving outside, heard voices calling, but they sounded distant and distorted, as if traveling through water to reach me. I grabbed Robert Pritchard's shoulder, shook him hard enough that his head snapped to the side, but his hand never stopped writing. They called us back. They called us back. When I tried to pull him from the chair, he was impossibly heavy, as if his body had somehow fused with the furniture beneath him. His skin felt wrong under my hands. Too cold, too rigid, more like weathered stone than living flesh. The lights began to flicker, which made no sense because I hadn't turned any lights on. But there they were, the overhead fixture pulsing in and out like a heartbeat. And in each moment of illumination, I could swear the photographs on the wall were different. The chiefs were no longer looking at the camera. They were looking at me. And in some of the photos, there seemed to be more men than there should be, figures standing in the background where I was certain nothing had been before. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy boots, multiple pairs, climbing with the steady rhythm of men who'd done it 1,000 times. The sound of equipment rattling, the particular metallic clink of carabiners and tools on bunker gear. I moved to the doorway, expecting to see firefighters arriving to help, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps kept coming, kept getting closer, but nothing appeared. The photographs on the walls seemed to blur as they passed, as if the men in the images were moving, stepping forward through the frames. My head felt light, my thoughts fragmenting like ice breaking on a winter lake. The gas, I told myself. The gas was making me hallucinate, but I could smell something else now, underneath the chemical reek of natural gas. Smoke. Old smoke, the kind that soaks into wood and fabric and never fully leaves. The smoke of 100 years of fire scenes brought home on dirty uniforms and unwashed skin. I heard voices then, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They were discussing a fire, describing a scene in technical terms I barely understood. Ventilation points and flashover risks and water supply issues. But the voices were wrong, layered on top of each other like recordings played simultaneously. Some speaking with the cadence of the 1950s, others with the inflection of even earlier eras, all of them discussing the same fire, as if it were happening right now. The house at 1847 Ashford Lane. This house. They were describing this house burning. Robert Pritchard finally looked up from his journal. His eyes were the same as his mother's, aware, tracking, but somehow absent, as if the person behind them had stepped out and left only the biological mechanisms functioning. He spoke, and his voice had the same layered quality as the others, as if multiple people were using his vocal cords to speak in unison. He told me the fire alarm hadn't been triggered by smoke or heat. It had been triggered by protocol. The guardian call, he called it, a tradition going back to the department's founding. When a chief died, they triggered the alarm in their home, called 911, and waited for the response. Not because they needed help, they were already past helping, but because it was time to pass the responsibility. The house had to burn. The line had to continue. Someone had to take the oath. I backed away from the desk, my hand fumbling for the doorway, but my body felt disconnected from my intentions, my movements sluggish and imprecise. The gas, surely it was just the gas clouding my mind, making me hear things that weren't there, see things that couldn't be real. But then the photographs began to peel away from the walls, not falling, but peeling themselves free, curling forward like hands reaching out. The images on them were moving now, undeniably. The firefighters stepping out of their frozen moments, turning to face me, their mouths opening in unison, though no sound emerged. In the flickering light, I could see that some of them were translucent, their forms rippling like heat shimmer, while others seemed solid enough to touch. The temperature dropped suddenly, drastically, my breath misting in the air despite the closed house. The gas smell was joined by another odor now, burnt flesh, melted plastic, the specific stench of a structure fire. Robert Pritchard stood from his chair with a movement so fluid it seemed inhuman, and behind him, the wall itself seemed to shimmer and shift, the photographs rearranging themselves into a pattern I couldn't quite comprehend, but that filled me with a dread so profound it felt like physical weight pressing down on my chest. I ran. There's no dignity in admitting it, but I ran, stumbling down the hallway toward the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off walls that seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my racing pulse. The photographs on the walls tracked my movement as I passed, every pair of eyes following my flight, and I heard boots behind me, dozens of pairs of boots, marching in formation down the hallway I just fled. The stairs seemed longer going down, the steps multiplying beneath my feet, and when I reached the bottom, Evelyn Pritchard was standing in the foyer, not sitting in her chair, but standing perfectly upright despite her age, still counting those numbers with mechanical precision. 17, 18, 47, 17, 18, 47. The front door was closed now, though I'd left it open. When I grabbed the handle, it was hot enough to burn my palm, hot enough that I jerked back with a curse. Through the door's window, I could see the fire trucks outside, see firefighters moving around with purpose, but they looked strange, their movements too slow, too deliberate, and their gear seemed wrong, a mix of modern equipment and antique brass and leather, as if multiple eras were existing simultaneously. A hand fell on my shoulder from behind. I spun, raising my flashlight like a weapon, and found myself facing Robert Pritchard. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, their forms flickering in and out of visibility, were the other chiefs. All of them. Generations of Pritchards in their dress uniforms, their faces wearing that same knowing expression from the photographs. Robert spoke, but his voice was lost in the chorus of voices that came with him, all speaking in unison, telling me the same thing. The house has to burn. The oath has to be taken. The line has to continue. The guardian call has been answered. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard the scrape of a match being struck. I don't remember how I got outside. One moment I was in that foyer, surrounded by the weight of a century of dead firefighters, and the next I was on the lawn, gasping for air that tasted clean and real. My hands clutching wet grass while rain pounded down on my back. The firefighters were around me immediately, asking if I was hurt, if anyone was still inside, and I tried to explain, tried to tell them about the gas leak, about the woman in the chair, and the man at the desk, and the photographs that moved. But the house looked normal. Through the windows, I could see the lights were on. Regular lights, no flickering. And there was no sign of gas, no smell carried on the wind. 2 firefighters came back out with Evelyn and Robert Pritchard, both of them walking normally, both of them confused about why everyone was making such a fuss. The woman didn't remember counting numbers, and Robert claimed he'd been asleep in bed, disturbed by the commotion. Neither of them smelled like gas. Neither of them showed any signs of distress. The fire chief, a man named Morrison, no relation to the Pritchards, took me aside and explained that the alarm had been triggered by a malfunction in the system, that there had never been a gas leak, that the 911 call had come from an emergency alert system test that had misfired. He showed me the report on his tablet, everything documented and explained, all the chaos reduced to a series of technical failures that had coincidental timing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the gas I'd smelled had been my imagination, that the hallucinations had been the product of stress and exhaustion, that everything I'd experienced had been the brain's attempt to make patterns from random events. But I couldn't stop thinking about those dates on the photographs, couldn't stop hearing that phrase repeated in that multi-voice chorus. The Guardian call has been answered. Morrison walked me back to my cruiser, his hand on my elbow like I was the one who needed help. And he told me something I couldn't quite process at the time. He said that Robert Pritchard's retirement last month hadn't been planned. The department had actually needed him to stay on for another year, but Robert had insisted, had seemed almost desperate to get out, and wouldn't explain why. Morrison said he'd seemed afraid, though of what, Robert wouldn't say. I sat in my cruiser for a long time after Morrison left, watching the house while the rain drummed on my roof. The Pritchards had gone back inside, and I could see their silhouettes moving behind the curtains, perfectly normal, living their perfectly normal lives. But I also saw other shadows in there, shapes that moved with purpose in rooms where the lights weren't on, figures that seemed to multiply the longer I watched. My radio crackled back to life, requesting my status, asking if I was returning to service. I started the engine, put the car in gear, and pulled away from 1847 Ashford Lane. In my rearview mirror, I watched the house recede into the rain-soaked darkness, and for just a moment, in that space between one blink and the next, I saw it as it might be or might have been or might one day become. Fully engulfed in flames, fire pouring from every window, while figures in firefighting gear from a dozen different eras stood in a circle around it, watching it burn. But when I blinked again, the house was just a house, dark and quiet in the November rain. Morrison called me 3 days later. Robert Pritchard had been found dead in his home, natural causes, nothing suspicious. Heart attack, the coroner ruled. He'd been sitting at his father's old desk, wearing his dress uniform, his chief's hat perfectly centered in front of him. The date of death was marked as November 17th, but Morrison mentioned something odd. The neighbor who'd found him swore she'd seen him alive on the 18th, had even waved to him through the window. But the body's condition suggested he'd been dead for at least 24 hours before discovery. I wanted to ask Morrison about the family history, about whether he knew that every fire chief in the Pritchard line had died on November 17th. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the tone of his voice, which carried an odd flatness, as if he were reading from a script. Or maybe it was the sound I heard in the background of his call, a sound that might have been nothing, or might have been boots walking on a hardwood floor, and voices speaking in layered harmonies about fires and protocols and calls that must be answered. I drive past 1847 Ashford Lane sometimes, always during the day, never at night. The house sits empty now, a for sale sign staked in the front yard that never seems to gather any interest. Evelyn Pritchard moved to a care facility, and the property waits for a new owner. But on certain mornings, when the light hits the windows just right, I can see figures moving inside. Multiple figures wearing what might be firefighting gear from different eras, all of them seeming to look out at the street as if waiting for something. Yesterday I saw that the for sale sign had been taken down. Morrison mentioned at the station that the house had finally sold, that the new owner was starting next month. He said it with that same flat tone, and he wouldn't meet my eyes when he told me the buyer's name, a young man, 25 years old, fresh out of the fire academy. His last name is Pritchard. Story 11. The smell hit me first. That particular combination of stale air, unwashed fabric, and something underneath that my brain couldn't quite categorize. Not decay, not exactly, but close enough to make my stomach tighten as I followed Rodriguez through the front door we'd just forced open. The neighbor who called it in stood on the sidewalk, arms wrapped around herself despite the August heat, watching us with the kind of expression that said she already knew what we'd find. 3 days of newspapers on the porch, no answer to repeated knocking, mailbox overflowing. A welfare check by the book, except my partner had that look on his face, the one he got when things were about to go sideways. 20 years on the force had given him instincts I was still developing, and right then, every one of those instincts was telling me to turn around and wait for backup we hadn't called. The living room was dark, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and in that dimness I could make out the usual debris of solitary living. Takeout containers, magazines, empty bottles arranged in careful rows on the coffee table. Nothing unusual, nothing immediately wrong, but the air felt thick, almost resistant, as if the house itself didn't want us there. Rodriguez moved ahead of me, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon, and I followed, my own breathing too loud in the silence. That's when I saw him. He was lying on his side on the couch, facing away from us, one arm dangling toward the floor. The skin I could see, his hand, the back of his neck, had that mottled purple-red coloring I'd seen in the Academy photos, the ones they showed you so you'd know what lividity looked like. Blood pooling in the lowest points of the body after the heart stops pumping. Gravity doing its work on the dead. My training kicked in automatically, clinical and detached. Male, approximately 50 to 60 years old, no obvious signs of trauma, possible natural causes, time of death estimated at... Then he rolled over. His eyes opened, roomy and unfocused, tracking slowly from Rodriguez to me with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, wasn't quite confusion. More like mild annoyance, the look you'd give someone who'd knocked on your door during your afternoon nap. His mouth worked for a moment before words came out, thick and slurred like he was talking through cotton. The question he asked made perfect sense. Why were we in his house? What gave us the right to break down his door? Except I couldn't process it because I was still staring at his hand, at the skin that had been livid purple just moments before, and now looked pale but normal, at the arm that had been hanging limp, and now pushed him upright with the jerky movements of someone not quite awake. Rodriguez was already backing away, his face gone white, and I should have done the same, but something kept me rooted there, watching as the man, I'd learn later his name was Thomas Brenner, though I try not to think of him by name, swung his legs off the couch and stood up with surprising steadiness. He moved past us toward the front door, muttering something about privacy and police harassment, and then he was gone, shuffling down his front walk in bare feet and flannel pajamas, while the neighbor who'd called it in stared with her mouth open. We filed the report as a mistake. Rodriguez wrote it up himself, explaining how the lighting had been poor, how we'd misinterpreted what we'd seen, how the man had simply been in a deep sleep. I signed it without argument because what else could I say? That I'd been absolutely certain I was looking at a corpse, that every piece of training I'd received told me that what we'd seen was impossible, that bodies don't just wake up after displaying clear signs of death. The alternative was admitting to something I didn't have words for, something that made my hands shake when I tried to hold my coffee that night. 7 days later, the same neighbor called it in again. Different officers responded, but I heard about it through the grapevine. Thomas Brenner, deceased in his living room, found on his couch in the exact same position I'd first seen him. Natural causes, the coroner said. Heart failure, time of death uncertain, but estimated at 3 to 4 days before discovery. That should have been the end of it. Case closed, man died alone. Tragedy, but not uncommon. Except it wasn't the end because I started seeing him. Not immediately. The first week after his actual death, I was fine. Shaken. Sure, but functional. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a misunderstanding, anything but what my gut insisted it had been. I worked my shifts, came home to my apartment, slept without dreaming. Normal. Perfectly normal. Then I woke up one night to the smell. That same combination of stale air and something underneath. That smell from his house, filling my bedroom. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and turned on the light to find nothing out of place. Windows closed, door locked, everything exactly as it should be. But the smell lingered for another minute before fading, and I spent the rest of the night on my couch with every light in the apartment burning. It happened again 2 nights later. This time the smell was stronger, and with it came a sound, a wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I searched every room, checked every closet and corner, found nothing. The sound stopped when I called Rodriguez in a panic, my voice cracking as I tried to explain. He came over, walked through with me, told me I needed to talk to someone about stress, offered to put in a word with the department counselor. He was kind about it, understanding even, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Not worry about what I'd experienced, but worry about me. I started avoiding sleep. Coffee and energy drinks became my diet, and I picked up every overtime shift I could find. Anything to stay awake, stay alert, stay away from my apartment and the smell that waited there in the dark hours. My performance reviews started slipping. I got written up for zoning out during roll call, for showing up late, for the tremor in my hands that made my shooting scores drop. The department counselor, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a box of tissues always within reach, listened to my carefully edited version of events and suggested I might be experiencing PTSD from accumulated job stress. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. Because by then, I'd started seeing him during the day too. Just glimpses at first. A figure at the edge of my vision that vanished when I turned my head. A shadow that didn't match anything casting it. Once, in my rearview mirror, I saw someone sitting in the back seat of my patrol car. Just for a second, just long enough to register the mottled purple skin. Before the seat was empty again. I pulled over, checked the car completely, found nothing. Rodriguez asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. The lies were getting easier. Then I started finding things in my apartment. Small things, easy to dismiss. A magazine I didn't remember buying, opened to an article about heart disease. Empty bottles arranged on my coffee table in a pattern I didn't recognize, but that felt somehow familiar. Once I came home to find my living room curtains drawn, though I always left them open. The room was dark, thick with that smell, and for just a moment I thought I saw someone lying on my couch, facing away from me, arm dangling toward the floor. I turned on the lights. The couch was empty, but the cushions were compressed, as if something heavy had been lying there moments before. I stopped going home, started sleeping in my car, or, when I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, on the couch in the station break room. Made excuses about my apartment being painted, having a plumbing issue, needing repairs. Nobody questioned it too closely. Cops sleeping at the station wasn't unusual during divorces or rough patches. They assumed I was going through something and gave me space. They were right, but not in the way they thought. Rodriguez finally cornered me after a particularly bad shift. I'd responded to a wellness check. The irony wasn't lost on me, and had frozen at the door, unable to make myself go inside. He'd taken point, found an elderly woman who'd fallen and couldn't reach her phone, called the paramedics, handled everything while I stood there shaking. Afterward, in the parking lot, he asked me what was really going on. I told him. All of it. The smell, the sounds, the glimpses, the feeling of being watched. The way Thomas Brenner's house had felt that day. Like something wrong had happened there. Like we'd interrupted something we weren't meant to see. The way I couldn't shake the image of those purple-red hands. The way they'd looked normal moments later, as if death itself had paused and then changed its mind. He listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me he'd been having dreams. Just dreams, he emphasized. Nothing like what I was experiencing. But in them, he was back in that house, and Thomas Brenner was still lying on the couch, except when he rolled over his eyes were wrong. Too aware, too focused, like whatever was looking out through them knew exactly what they'd seen and was angry about the interruption. We sat there in his car, two grown men afraid to voice what we both suspected, that what we'd witnessed that day wasn't a man waking from a deep sleep, but something else, something that shouldn't have been possible, and that whatever it wasn't finished with us. That conversation was 3 weeks ago. Rodriguez requested a transfer to another district, said it was for family reasons, a better commute, nothing to do with what happened. His request was approved immediately. Good cops are in demand everywhere. He left without saying goodbye, and I don't blame him. I'm alone with this now. The episodes are getting worse. Last night I woke up, or thought I did, to find myself lying on my couch in my apartment, though I distinctly remember falling asleep in my car. My arm was dangling toward the floor, and when I tried to move it, I couldn't. My whole body felt heavy, pressed down by something invisible, and the smell was so strong I could taste it. I could feel my heart struggling, each beat irregular and painful, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I closed my eyes again, I wouldn't wake up. Not the way I was supposed to. So I forced them open, forced myself to move, felt whatever was holding me down release with an almost audible snap. I drove straight to the station, filed paperwork until my shift started, acted normal because what else can I do? Tell someone that I think I'm being haunted by a man who died after we interrupted whatever process had already started, that I'm afraid I'm experiencing what he experienced, that the lividity I saw wasn't death but something worse, a preview, a warning, a doorway that opened and never quite closed. The department counselor has recommended I take medical leave. Stress, she says, burnout. I have all the classic symptoms and nobody would blame me for needing time off. She's probably right. The rational part of my brain knows she's right. But the smell is here now, even in her office as I sit across from her, nodding at her suggestions. And in the window behind her, I can see a reflection that doesn't match the room. A figure lying on a couch, arm hanging down, skin mottled purple-red. As I watch, it begins to roll over. I don't wait to see what happens next. I stand up, thank her for her time, walk out of her office with careful, measured steps. In the hallway, I catch my reflection in the glass of a door and almost don't recognize myself. The dark circles under my eyes, the pallor of my skin, the way I hold myself as if I'm already carrying extra weight. Tonight, I'll try to sleep again. Maybe in my car, maybe here at the station, maybe not at all. But I know the smell will find me, the sounds will find me, and eventually, inevitably, I'll close my eyes and feel that weight pressing down, feel my heart struggling, feel the blood beginning to pool in all the wrong places while some part of me is still aware, still conscious, still trapped in the space between. I think about Thomas Brenner every day now. Wonder if he knew what was happening to him. If he felt it coming. That slow shutdown. The body giving up while the mind stayed horribly, impossibly aware. If that's what we interrupted that day. Not a man sleeping, not a man dying, but a man caught in between, experiencing something that should happen quickly, mercifully, but was instead stretched out, prolonged, made into something conscious and aware. And I wonder if, when it finally takes me, someone will come to check on me. If they'll break down my door and find me lying there, arm dangling, skin showing all the signs. If I'll roll over and ask them why they're in my house, knowing even as I do that it's already too late, that the machinery has started and won't be stopped, only paused. The worst part is not knowing if this is guilt manifesting as paranoia, my mind punishing me for what I failed to prevent. Not knowing if it's real, if there's something genuine stalking me, some consequence for witnessing what I witnessed. Not knowing if I'm slowly losing my grip on reality, or if reality itself has become something I no longer understand. I check my hands throughout the day now, looking for signs of discoloration, feeling for that particular cold that seems to come from inside rather than outside. My apartment waits for me, curtains drawn, couch empty but somehow occupied, and somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, between living and what comes after, Thomas Brenner is still rolling over, still asking his question, still looking at me with eyes that know exactly what I saw and what it means. The smell is stronger tonight. My hands are shaking as I write this, and I'm not sure anymore if it's from the coffee or from something else. Something colder and more permanent. The department counselor's voice echoes in my head, professional and kind, suggesting rest, suggesting help, suggesting that what I'm experiencing has a name and a treatment. But I know better now. I know that some doors, once opened, don't close. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. And some deaths don't happen all at once. They happen slowly, consciously, with full awareness of every stage, every system shutting down, every moment of that terrible in-between. I think Thomas Brenner is still in that space, and I think, somehow, he's found a way to reach back and show me what it's like. Tomorrow I'll call in sick, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll show up for my shift and pretend everything is fine. Because what else can I do? Quit the force? Leave town? As if geography matters when the smell finds me everywhere, when the glimpses follow me regardless of location, when my own body is becoming the crime scene. The couch in my apartment is waiting. I can feel it, even from here, even with miles between us. It's waiting with the patience of something that knows its work is already done. That what began in Thomas Brenner's living room 3 weeks ago set something in motion that won't stop until it reaches its natural conclusion. And when it does, when I finally lie down and feel that weight, that cold, that slow shutdown, will I have the strength to roll over? Will I ask my question to whoever finds me, knowing they'll file their report and walk away, never quite forgetting what they saw but unable to explain it, unable to make sense of it? Will I become what Thomas Brenner became? A warning that goes unheeded, a mystery that goes unsolved, a story that gets passed around in quiet voices until it becomes just another strange call in a career full of strange calls. The smell is here now. It's always here. And somewhere in the dark, something is lying on a couch, arm dangling, waiting for me to finally understand what I saw that day, waiting for me to lie down and join it. Story 12. The cold had teeth that night. I'd been working security at the Riverside construction site for 3 months, and I thought I'd seen everything the winter could throw at me. Frozen pipes, equipment failures, the occasional vagrant looking for shelter in the half-finished buildings. Nothing I couldn't handle with a thermos of coffee and a firm voice. But that Thursday night in late February, something changed. The air felt different, heavier somehow, like the atmosphere before a storm that never quite arrives. My shift started at 10. The site supervisor had mentioned something about checking the north perimeter more frequently. There'd been complaints from the residential area backing onto the property. Strange noises, shadows moving between the skeletal frames of what would eventually become luxury condominiums. Probably kids, he'd said, but his eyes hadn't quite met mine when he said it. The site sprawled across 4 acres of former industrial land, a maze of concrete pillars, exposed rebar, and plastic sheeting that snapped and whispered in the wind. My trailer sat at the main entrance, a metal box with a space heater that rattled like it had emphysema. I did my rounds every hour, flashlight cutting through the darkness, boots crunching on frozen ground. Everything was fine until midnight. I was in the trailer, filling out the log, when I felt it. A vibration that started deep in my chest, like standing too close to a subway train. The coffee in my mug rippled in concentric circles. My pen rolled off the desk. The sensation lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I stood, pressing my hand against the trailer wall. The metal was cold and still. No aftershock, no continuation of whatever that had been. The rational part of my brain suggested construction equipment, maybe something from the hospital project 2 blocks over, but it was midnight. No one ran heavy machinery at midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The February air hit me like a fist, stealing my breath. The site stretched out before me, monuments of unfinished ambition casting long shadows under the security lights. Everything looked normal. I started walking, my flashlight beam bouncing off plastic sheeting and stacks of materials. The beam caught something on the roof of Building C, a silhouette, human-shaped. standing at the edge where the 5th floor ended in open air. My heart kicked up. The figure was completely still, arms at its sides, facing away from me. Too tall to be anyone I knew, too exposed to be anyone who belonged there. I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast emptiness. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me in any way. I moved closer, my flashlight trained on the roof. The beam couldn't quite reach that high, just illuminated the concrete and rebar below. I called out again, louder this time, adding that this was private property and I was calling the police. Still nothing. The figure remained motionless, a paper cutout against the deeper darkness of the sky. Then it moved. Not walked, not turned. It simply shifted position, and suddenly it was facing me. Even from 100 feet away, even with only the ambient security lights to see by, I could feel the weight of its attention. The sensation crawled across my skin like insects, raising every hair on my arms. My breath came in short gasps that turned to vapor in the freezing air. I don't remember making the decision to leave. My body just turned and started walking back toward the trailer, faster than I intended, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. The rational part of my brain screamed that I was abandoning my post, that I was being paid to handle situations exactly like this. But something older and more fundamental had taken control, something that understood danger in a language that predated words. Behind me, I heard a sound. Not footsteps, not anything that should come from a construction site at midnight. It was a wet sliding noise, like something heavy being dragged across concrete, or something moving that had too many joints, too many surfaces making contact with the ground. I didn't look back. I reached the trailer and yanked the door open, practically falling inside. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone from the desk. I'd call the police, let them handle whatever squatter or junkie was up there. But when I pressed the power button, nothing happened. The screen remained black. I held down the power button, tried again. Dead. Completely dead. That was impossible. I'd charged it fully before my shift. It had been at 97% when I checked it during my last round. The trailer's overhead light flickered once, twice, then died. My space heater wheezed into silence. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the distant security lights outside. I fumbled for my flashlight, found it on the desk where I'd dropped it. The beam seemed weaker somehow, struggling against the shadows that pressed in from every corner. Outside, something scraped against the trailer wall. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Metal on metal. Or maybe something harder than metal. Something that shouldn't be scraping at all. The sound moved along the wall, from the door toward the window. I stood frozen, flashlight gripped in both hands, watching the window. The glass was covered in condensation from the temperature difference, turning the outside world into a blur of gray and black. Then I saw it, a handprint. It appeared on the outside of the glass, fingers spread wide. But the condensation around it wasn't just clearing, it was melting, running down the window in rivulets, as if the hand was burning hot. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own hand. As I watched, a second print appeared next to the first. Then a third, higher up, where no one standing on the ground could reach. The handprints began to multiply. Dozens of them, appearing all over the window, each one melting the condensation in perfect clarity. They overlapped and intersected, creating a pattern that hurt to look at, that seemed to suggest a geometry that didn't exist in 3 dimensions. I backed away until I hit the far wall of the trailer. My breath came in ragged gasps. The flashlight beam trembled in my grip. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by a new noise, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The trailer began to shake, coffee mug chattering across the desk, papers sliding to the floor, the overhead light swinging on its fixture, even though there was no power to make it glow. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The shaking ceased, the vibration faded. The only sound was my own breathing, and the distant hum of the security lights. I remained pressed against the wall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, my training overcame my terror. I needed to document this. Whatever this was, whatever had just happened, I needed proof. My flashlight worked fine as I approached the window. The handprints were still there, but now they looked different. The glass where they'd appeared was cracked, spiderweb patterns radiating from each print. Not broken, but damaged, as if subjected to extreme temperature changes. I touched one crack with my finger. The glass was warm. I spent the rest of the night in that trailer, flashlight on, watching the window. Nothing else happened. The security lights continued their steady glow. The wind moved plastic sheeting somewhere in the site. Normal sounds. Normal sights. By the time my shift ended at 6, with the winter sun just beginning to gray the horizon, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the worst of it. Then I went to my car. It was parked in the small lot outside the site entrance. A 10-year-old sedan that burned oil and had a temperamental starter. But it was mine, and it was warm, and I couldn't wait to get inside and drive away from this place. The snow had started falling sometime after 4, a light dusting that covered everything in pristine white. My car wore a thin blanket of it, the kind that brushes off easily, except for the hood. On the hood, the snow had melted in a specific pattern, the shape of a body. It was unmistakable. Head, torso, arms, legs, all outlined in negative space where something had lain on the hood long enough to melt the snow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the windshield. More handprints. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Covering every inch of glass. They'd melted the snow in those spots, creating perfect impressions in water and ice. The same impossibly large hands. The same wrong geometry to their arrangement. And in the center, where the driver would sit, a clear space. A window through which I could see my steering wheel, my dashboard, my rearview mirror. Something had been on my car. Something had pressed itself against the hood and covered the windshield in handprints while leaving me a space to see through, while making sure I'd know it had been there. I stood in the parking lot as the sun rose, staring at my car, while my mind tried and failed to process what I was seeing. The rational explanations came and went, each one more desperate than the last. Vandals, a prank, some kind of chemical reaction with the snow, but none of them explained the body print. None of them explained the heat that must have been involved to melt the snow so completely. Behind me, I heard the scraping sound again. I turned slowly, every muscle tense. The construction site stretched out in the early morning light, all its rough edges softened by the thin layer of snow. Nothing moved. No silhouettes on roofs. No impossible hands pressing against glass. Just concrete and steel and plastic sheeting moving gently in the wind. But I felt it watching me. From the shadows between the buildings, from the unfinished floors that gaped like empty eye sockets, from somewhere I couldn't see but could absolutely feel. The weight of attention pressed down on me like a physical thing, making my knees weak and my vision blur at the edges. I got in my car. The interior was freezing, but I didn't care. I just needed to leave. The engine turned over on the third try, and I reversed out of the parking spot with a screech of tires on ice. As I put the car in drive, I looked back at the trailer one last time. The door was open. I knew I'd closed it. I'd checked it twice, making sure it was locked before walking to my car. But now it stood wide open, darkness spilling out into the gray morning light. And there, just visible in that darkness, was a shape. Tall. Too tall. Standing just inside the doorway, watching me leave. I drove away fast enough that my tires spun on the ice. I didn't look back again. When I got home, I went straight to bed, still wearing my uniform, and slept until the following evening. When I woke, I found a text message on my phone, which was somehow now working perfectly, from the site supervisor. He wanted to know why I'd left 3 hours before my shift ended. He wanted to know why the security footage showed the trailer door opening and closing repeatedly throughout the night, even though I'd been inside. He wanted to know if I planned to return to work. I didn't answer. Instead, I called the phone company and asked them to check my phone records. They confirmed what I already knew. My phone had been active all night. I'd received signals, maintained connection to the network. It had never been dead, but I'd held it in my hands. I'd pressed the buttons. I'd seen the black screen. 3 days later, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed my car in the parking lot, taken from an elevated position. The angle suggested whoever took it was standing on the roof of Building C. The photograph was crisp and clear, showing every detail of the handprints on my windshield and the body-shaped absence of snow on my hood. But that wasn't what made me drop the photograph. What made my hands shake and my vision swim was the timestamp in the corner. The photograph had been taken at 12:04 a.m., less than 5 minutes after I'd felt that first vibration, before I'd seen the silhouette, before anything else had happened. Whatever had been on that roof, whatever had pressed its hands against my trailer window and my windshield, whatever had lain on the hood of my car, it had been there before I'd seen it. It had been watching me, waiting for me to notice, and it had taken a photograph to prove it. I never went back to the site. I never picked up my last paycheck. The supervisor stopped calling after a week, but sometimes, late at night, I feel that vibration again, a tremor that starts deep in my chest and radiates outward, shaking coffee mugs and rolling pens off tables. And when I look out my window, I see handprints on the glass, on my car when I go outside in the morning. Always the same impossible size, always melting whatever they touch. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what found me in that trailer, what pressed itself against my car while I cowered inside. The rational part of my brain still suggests explanations, each one more strained than the last. But late at night, when the vibrations come and I see the handprints appear on my bedroom window, I know the truth. It wasn't something at the construction site. It never was. It followed me home. Story 13. The fluorescent lights in the office had always hummed, but I'd never noticed how the sound seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat trapped in glass and wiring. 3 months had passed since the building manager found him, and still, nobody wanted to sit in that cube. The chair remained pushed back at an angle, exactly as the paramedics had left it. Someone had wiped down the desk, but the monitor still bore a faint residue of fingerprints that caught the light in certain ways, creating ghostly impressions against the black screen. I stood at the entrance to his workspace now, holding a form from legal that authorized me to search his files for the Henderson project documentation. The company needed those files. Deadlines didn't stop for grief or guilt or the peculiar silence that had settled over our floor like dust. The cube smelled different than mine, a mixture of old coffee and something chemical, maybe the cleaning solution they'd used. I hesitated before stepping inside, my hand hovering over the light switch. The rational part of my brain insisted that this was just a workspace, just equipment, just data stored on drives that knew nothing of the hands that had typed on them. But standing there in the doorway, I felt the weight of absence pressing against my chest, making each breath deliberate. I flipped the switch. The overhead light flickered twice before holding steady, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes shadows look deeper than they should. His desktop tower sat beneath the desk, its power button glowing amber in sleep mode. I settled into the chair. It adjusted too easily to my weight, the hydraulics still responsive, and pressed the button. The machine woke with a mechanical sigh, fans spinning to life inside the case. The boot sequence seemed longer than it should have been, the screen displaying initialization messages that scrolled past too quickly to read. I found myself counting my heartbeats against the loading bar's progress, watching as the operating system loaded with agonizing deliberation. When the login screen appeared, I entered the generic credentials that IT had provided. The desktop materialized, and I was confronted with his digital workspace. Icons arranged with meticulous precision, folders labeled in that abbreviation system everyone developed but no one else understood. The wallpaper was the default corporate image, that meaningless abstract pattern of intersecting lines. I opened the File Explorer and began searching, clicking through directories with the methodical tedium of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. financial reports, meeting notes, correspondence organized by quarter and client. Everything professionally maintained, giving no indication of the chaos that must have been churning beneath the surface in those final weeks. The Henderson folder was buried 3 levels deep in projects, dated from last year. I began copying files to the network drive, watching the progress bar creep forward. Outside the cube, the office maintained its artificial silence, the kind of quiet that happens when people are present but deliberately avoiding noise, as if sound itself might crack the fragile normalcy we'd constructed over the past months. That's when I heard the sound from downstairs. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound, a sudden pressure change that made my ears pop, followed by the distinct notification chime of our instant messaging system. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing through the ventilation system, but I knew it originated from the floor below, where the support staff worked. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the file transfer, but something about that notification chime lodged itself in my mind, insistent and wrong. We'd all been on edge since it happened, jumping at unexpected noises, reading too much into coincidences. I told myself it was just another message, just another colleague pinging someone about spreadsheets or lunch orders. The file transfer completed. I should have logged out, returned to my own desk, filed the completion notice with legal. Instead, I found myself opening his email client. The interface loaded with his last session still active, messages organized into folders that suggested a mind that sought control through categorization. Inbox, sent, archive, each meticulously maintained. I clicked on sent, scrolling through the final messages he'd composed. Client updates, meeting requests, a brief exchange about project deadlines. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that suggested what was coming. I was about to close the program when the instant messenger icon in the taskbar began blinking orange. My hands froze over the keyboard. The messenger application wasn't supposed to be running. ET had disabled all his accounts, changed every password, revoked every credential. That had been standard procedure after the incident. Lock down the digital identity, preserve the data, prevent exactly this kind of confusion. The icon continued blinking, patient and persistent. I moved the cursor toward it, my finger trembling slightly over the mouse button. Every rational instinct told me it was a system glitch, some automated process that hadn't been properly terminated. But the fluorescent hum seemed louder now, more insistent, and I became aware of the temperature in the cube, how it felt several degrees cooler than the surrounding office. I clicked. The messenger window expanded, revealing a conversation list. At the top, marked with a red dot indicating an unread message, was a contact name I recognized. Dwyer, from the support team downstairs. The preview pane showed nothing, no text, no emoji, just a blank space where a message should be. I stared at that blank space, my mind working through possibilities. A corrupted packet, a Unicode error, a fragment of data caught in transmission. Technical explanations presented themselves in neat, rational order, but my hands felt cold, and I noticed I'd been holding my breath. The timestamp showed the message had been sent 17 seconds ago, while I'd been sitting here, while I'd been logged in under his credentials. I needed to call IT, report the anomaly, let someone with actual authority investigate the system. But I found myself clicking on the conversation instead, opening the full chat history. The window filled with messages exchanged over months, mundane work discussions, shared frustrations about deadlines, occasional moments of humor expressed through carefully professional language. I scrolled upward through time, watching their working relationship documented in time-stamped exchanges. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning. Then I reached the messages from his final day. The last exchange had occurred at 6:47 p.m., well after most of the office had emptied. Dwyer had sent a question about a server migration. The response had come 3 minutes later. "I'll be here late. Come up if you need anything." But Dwyer had mentioned, during those awful first days after, that he'd never gotten a reply to his last message. He'd gone home assuming the question could wait until morning. The guilt had carved itself into his features during the memorial service, visible in the way he'd avoided looking at anyone directly. So when had this message been sent? I checked the timestamp again, then cross-referenced it with the official timeline IT had constructed. According to their forensic analysis, the last activity on this machine had occurred at 6:44 p.m., a document save, followed by systematic file closures, then nothing. The system had gone into sleep mode at 6:58 p.m., untouched. This message showing in the logs shouldn't exist. I became aware of a pressure behind my eyes, that particular strain that came from staring at screens too long. I rubbed my face, trying to dispel the growing unease that had settled into my stomach. There had to be an explanation. Systems logged things incorrectly all the time. Timestamps got corrupted. Data persisted in caches and buffers. Ghost information that appeared in the wrong contexts. Downstairs, I heard someone's phone ring, the sound carrying through the floor with unusual clarity. Then footsteps, someone moving quickly across the support floor. A door opened and closed with the pneumatic hiss of the stairwell entrance. The messenger icon blinked orange again. This time, I watched it happen in real time. The conversation with Dwyer updated, a new message appearing in the preview pane. Another blank. No text, no content, just an entry in the log showing that something had been transmitted from this account to that one. My chair creaked as I pushed back from the desk, the sound abnormally loud in the cube's confines. I could feel my pulse in my throat now, a thick presence that made swallowing difficult. This needed to stop. I needed to call someone, report this, let professionals handle whatever malfunction was occurring in the system, but I couldn't stop staring at that messenger window, at the conversation history that shouldn't exist, at the new message that contained nothing and somehow felt more threatening than any words could be. I heard footsteps in the stairwell, rapid, echoing in that particular way concrete stairs amplify sound. Someone was coming up. The door at the end of our floor banged open, and I heard breathing, quick and panicked, followed by Dwyer's voice calling out my name with an urgency that made my skin prickle. He appeared at the cube entrance, his face pale, one hand gripping the partition wall. His eyes went immediately to the monitor, to the messenger window still open and displaying our one-sided conversation. He tried to speak but seemed unable to form words, just pointed at the screen and then at himself, his hand trembling visibly. Finally, he managed. "Did you send those?" I shook my head, my own voice feeling distant when I replied that I hadn't sent anything, that the messages were already here when I opened the application. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to name, settling finally on something that looked like recognition mixed with dread. He moved closer to the monitor, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and see the way his pupils had dilated, black pools that reflected the screen's glow. "I got 5 of them," he said quietly. 5 blank messages, back to back, all from his account. I checked with IT 20 minutes ago. They swore everything was locked down, disabled, impossible. But I'm looking at them right now on my phone. He pulled out his device, hand shaking as he turned the screen toward me. Sure enough, the Messenger app showed 5 consecutive blank messages from this account, time-stamped within the last half hour. "I thought someone was messing with me," he continued, his voice taking on a ragged edge. "Some sick joke, someone who got his credentials. But IT checked. Nobody's logged in. Nobody's accessed this account. Nobody except..." He stopped, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. We both stared at the computer, at the Messenger application that continued running despite every technical impossibility, at the blank messages that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the fluorescent lights overhead. That's when the screen flickered. Not a normal flicker, not the brief dimming of a loose connection or power fluctuation. The entire display went dark for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for me to see both our faces reflected in the black glass, pale and distorted. When it returned, the Messenger window had changed. A new message had appeared in the conversation with Dwyer. Not blank this time, 3 words, in that default system font that made every message look impersonal and cold. "Still here late." We both saw it. We both read it. Neither of us moved. The timestamp showed it had been sent 2 seconds ago. from this machine while we'd been watching. Dwyer made a sound, not quite a word, more like air escaping from a punctured seal. He backed away from the cube, his eyes never leaving the monitor, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to startle something dangerous. I wanted to tell him it was a virus, a script, some piece of malicious code that had survived the system purge. I wanted to explain it away with technical jargon and rational analysis, but my mouth felt full of cotton, and my hands had gone numb where they rested on the armrests of this chair that adjusted too easily, this chair that someone else had adjusted to their body 3 months ago. The fans in the computer tower changed pitch, spinning faster, the sound rising to something almost like speech, if you listened in a certain way. The fluorescent light directly above the cube began to flicker in rhythm with the hard drive activity light, pulsing on and off in patterns that felt deliberate. I should have left. We both should have left. But I found myself reaching for the mouse again, moving the cursor across the screen. My fingers typed without conscious direction, responding in the messenger window. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly, character by character, appearing on screen as if being typed in real time. "Come up if you need anything." The same phrase from 3 months ago, the last message sent before everything ended. Dwyer's phone vibrated in his hand. He looked down at it, then back up at me, his face drained of color. He turned the screen toward me again. Another blank message, then another. They were coming faster now, one every few seconds, filling his notification bar with those empty rectangles that somehow communicated more than any words. The temperature in the cube had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath misting in front of my face, could feel the cold radiating from the monitor itself. The messenger window continued updating, new messages appearing in the conversation log, some blank, some repeating that same phrase, some showing timestamps from months ago interspersed with current times, creating an impossible chronology that hurt to look at directly. I tried to close the application, but the cursor wouldn't respond. Tried to shut down the computer, but the power button did nothing when pressed. The machine had taken on a life of its own, processes running in the background, the activity monitor showing CPU usage spiking to levels that should have made the system crash. That's when I noticed something else. In the reflection on the monitor's glass, behind where Dwyer and I stood, I could see the cube's entrance. And in that reflection, distorted by the screen's curve and the flickering light, there appeared to be 3 figures visible. I turned around slowly, knowing what I would find, what I wouldn't find. The entrance was empty. Just the partition walls and the industrial carpet and the ambient light from the surrounding workspace. But when I looked back at the monitor, back at that dark reflection trapped in glass, the 3rd figure remained visible, indistinct, but present, occupying the chair I was sitting in, occupying the same space as my own reflected form. Dwyer saw it too. I knew because he went very still, the kind of stillness that comes from prey animals when they sense a predator. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, too fast and too loud. The messenger application began scrolling through the conversation history automatically, moving backwards through time, showing months of mundane exchanges until it reached the very first message they'd exchanged when he'd joined the company. Then it continued scrolling up, past the beginning, into blank space where no messages should exist. And in that blank space, new text began appearing. Not messages. Something else. Lines of text that formed a pattern, a structure I almost recognized but couldn't quite grasp. It looked like code, but not any programming language I knew. It looked like coordinates, but not for any map that existed in normal space. It looked like a message, but written in a grammar of absence, of negative space, of all the words that hadn't been said in those final hours. The screen flickered again, and when it stabilized, the messenger window showed a new conversation, one that had never existed, one that couldn't exist. A conversation with myself, filled with messages I'd never sent, responses I'd never made, a dialogue that documented exchanges that never occurred but felt sickeningly familiar, like memories of dreams half remembered upon waking. And at the bottom of this impossible conversation, typing indicators appeared. 3 dots pulsing in rhythm with the fluorescent hum. Someone was responding in real time. Someone was on the other end of this digital void, reaching across 3 months and the gulf between states of being, trying to communicate something that had no words. The typing continued, dots appearing and disappearing, appearing and disappearing, while Dwyer's phone buzzed continuously in his hand, an endless stream of blank notifications that made the device shake with the force of incoming signals. I finally found my voice, managed to push words through the constriction in my throat, told Dwyer we needed to leave, needed to get IT, needed to get anyone who could explain this in terms that made sense. But even as I spoke, I was reading the messages as they appeared on screen, watching that impossible conversation update with responses to questions I'd never asked, apologies for misunderstandings we'd never had, promises to finish work that had been abandoned in a moment of final desperation. The lights in the cube went out completely, plunging us into darkness broken only by the monitor's glow. In that artificial illumination, I could see the reflection more clearly now. That third figure, sitting exactly where I sat, fingers positioned over a keyboard, typing messages that traveled through networks and systems, and the fragile barrier between what was and what persisted. When the overhead light snapped back on, Dwyer was gone. I heard his footsteps echoing down the stairwell, rapid and retreating. I should have followed. Should have run. Should have done anything except sit there, watching the screen, reading those messages that kept coming, each one more specific, more personal, more impossible. Because they knew things. Details about my work, my habits, my thoughts during those final weeks when the pressure had mounted and the deadlines had multiplied, and the isolation of our individual cubes had made it easy to forget that people around us were drowning in the same waters. The messenger application pinged again, that distinctive sound that now seemed to come from inside my own head. A new message appeared, and this one was different from all the others. This one was a question, direct and impossible to ignore. Are you still there? My hands moved to the keyboard. I didn't decide to type. The action happened independently of will or choice, fingers finding keys through muscle memory. I watched myself respond. Yes. The reply came instantly. I've been trying to reach you. The cursor blinked in the text field, waiting for my response. Around me, the office maintained its careful silence, but I could sense movement in peripheral cubes. Colleagues going about their tasks, unaware of what was happening in this space, this digital seance occurring on equipment that should have been decommissioned months ago. I typed, "This isn't real." The response, "Does that matter?" And somehow, in the growing cold and the flickering light and the persistent hum of machinery that seemed to carry meaning just beyond comprehension, I couldn't answer that question. Because real or not, the messages continued. Because real or not, something was reaching out across the digital void. Because real or not, I was still sitting in this chair, still reading these words, still unable to close the window, or shut down the machine, or walk away from this conversation that shouldn't exist. The screen displayed a new message. Don't leave it too late. I don't know if it was a warning or a memory or just random text generated by corrupted code. I don't know if the third figure in the reflection was a ghost or a hallucination, or just a trick of light and glass, and my own guilt-strained perception. What I know is this. When I finally forced myself to stand, to step away from that cube, to leave the machine running with its impossible messages and its conversation with the void, I heard the notification chime one more time, not from the computer I was leaving behind, from my own phone, in my own pocket. A message from an account that had been disabled 3 months ago. Blank, like all the others Dwyer had received. And then another. And another. I'm back at my own desk now. The file transfer was successful. Legal has been notified. The Henderson project can proceed. Everything is documented and professional and proceeding according to standard business practices. But my messenger application keeps running, even though I've tried to close it 17 times. The conversation list shows active sessions with people I haven't spoken to in years, with accounts that were decommissioned, with usernames that look almost but not quite like the names they should be. And at the very top of the list, marked unread, a conversation with my own account. Messages I'm sending to myself. Responses I haven't written yet, but somehow already appear on screen. A dialogue that extends into the future, showing tomorrow's exchanges, next week's questions, an entire conversation that hasn't happened yet, but has already been recorded in the system. The last message, time-stamped 3 months from now, reads, "Still here late." Outside my cube, the fluorescent lights continue their steady hum. My colleagues type and click and speak in carefully modulated voices, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Nobody notices that my screen is frozen, that my hands have stopped moving, that I've been staring at this impossible conversation for the last 20 minutes without blinking. Or maybe they do notice. Maybe they see but choose not to acknowledge. The same way we all chose not to acknowledge the signs 3 months ago. Maybe that's how it works. We occupy our cubes, sealed in our individual silences, each experiencing our own impossible messages while pretending that everything follows the logical rules we've been taught to trust. The messenger notification chimes again. I don't need to look to know what I'll see. Another blank message. Another entry in a conversation that exists in the space between what we can explain and what we experience. Another ping from somewhere that isn't quite here and isn't quite gone. I should call IT. I should report this. I should do something other than sit here watching the typing indicators pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat, knowing that on the other end of this digital thread, something is waiting for me to respond. My hands return to the keyboard. I type, "What do you want?" The response appears character by character, slower this time, as if the effort of communication is becoming more difficult. To finish the conversation, I wait, but nothing else comes. Just that single line, hanging in the chat window, and the typing indicators that pulse and fade and pulse again, but never resolve into words. The fluorescent lights flicker once, twice, then hold steady. The temperature normalizes. The world returns to its carefully maintained equilibrium of carpet and partitions, and the endless drone of machines processing data that may or may not mean anything at all. But I know, with a certainty that bypasses logic and settles directly into the primitive parts of my brain that still recognize when they're being hunted, that this conversation isn't over. That somewhere in the network, in the saved sessions and cached data and ghost files that persist beyond deletion, pieces of consciousness have learned to navigate the digital infrastructure we've built. And I know that eventually, when the office empties and the lights dim, and I find myself staying late to finish just one more task, I'll boot up my machine and see that orange icon blinking, insistent and patient, waiting for me to respond, waiting for me to come up if I need anything, waiting in that cube that nobody wants to occupy, in that space between one state and another, in the silence that sounds like 1,000 whispered conversations if you listen in just the right way. Story 14. The thing about Blood Mountain is that it earns its name in ways the trail guides don't mention. We pitched our tent just below the summit as the October sun bled into the horizon, painting the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of rust and shadow. My hiking partner, call him what you want, I've tried to forget his name, had insisted on this spot despite my objections. Too exposed, I'd said, too far from the main trail. But he'd laughed it off, reminding me we'd come here precisely to escape civilization, to find that raw edge where comfort ends and something more primal begins. I should have trusted my instincts. The first hour after sunset felt normal enough. We cooked dehydrated meals over our portable stove, the blue flame hissing against the gathering dark. The temperature dropped fast at this elevation, and we retreated into the tent early, our breath forming clouds in the cramped space. Through the thin nylon walls, the forest settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through dead leaves, the occasional crack of a branch adjusting to the cold. My companion fell asleep quickly, his breathing deepening into soft snores. I lay awake longer, staring at the tent's ceiling, watching shadows play across the fabric as our dying headlamp flickered. Sleep felt distant, as if some part of my nervous system refused to fully surrender to unconsciousness. The mountain had a presence that pressed against my awareness, heavy and patient. I was drifting finally when I heard it. The voice. It came from somewhere beyond the tent, feminine and clear despite the distance. The sound seemed to spiral through the trees, words I couldn't quite distinguish but which carried an unmistakable quality of distress. My eyes snapped open. The voice came again, now from a different direction entirely, as if the speaker had somehow relocated 30 yards in the span of seconds. Impossible, but there it was. I reached over and shook my partner awake. He grumbled, disoriented, asking what was wrong. I told him to listen, to stay quiet. We both held our breath in the darkness. The voice emerged once more, this time from what seemed like directly behind our tent, so close I could almost feel the vibration of it through the ground. It was calling something, a name maybe, or just a wordless plea. Then it shifted again, now distant, emanating from the direction of the summit. The sound moved in ways that defied logic, as if multiple sources were speaking in perfect synchronization, or as if the mountain itself was throwing the voice across its face like a ventriloquist. My companion whispered that it must be another hiker, maybe someone lost or injured. The rational explanation, the one we wanted to believe. But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We'd seen no other campers when we arrived, no tents or signs of human presence anywhere near the summit. And there was something in the quality of that voice, something that felt less like a call for help and more like a lure. We decided to wait, to see if it happened again. Minutes stretched in absolute silence. I counted my heartbeats, felt sweat forming despite the cold, every sense straining against the darkness. Just as I began to convince myself we'd imagined it, the footsteps started. They began far off, the soft compression of leaves and twigs under weight. Slow, measured steps, coming closer. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal moving naturally through the forest. There was purpose in those footsteps, a directed intention that made my spine go rigid. I fumbled for my headlamp, but my companion grabbed my wrist, his grip urgent. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't let it know we're awake. It, not them." Even then, we were already thinking of whatever was out there as something other than human. The footsteps circled our tent in a wide arc, maintaining a distance of maybe 20 feet. I tried to track the sound, turning my head slowly, but the movement seemed wrong. Sometimes the steps came from two directions at once, overlapping in a way that suggested multiple entities. Other times they would pause completely, and in that silence I could sense something standing perfectly still, waiting, listening for us as intently as we listened for it. Then I saw them, the eyes. Through the mesh window of our tent, I caught a glimpse of 2 points of red light hovering at approximately human height, perhaps 15 feet away. They didn't glow with the reflective quality of animal eyes caught in beam of light. These were self-luminous, burning with an inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heart. I couldn't look away. The eyes held me transfixed, and in that moment I felt utterly exposed, as if those burning points of light could see through the tent fabric, through my skin, straight into the core of whatever I was. My companion saw them too. I felt him go absolutely still beside me, his breath catching. We didn't speak. What was there to say? We both understood instinctively that making a sound now would be catastrophic, though neither of us could have explained why. The eyes blinked, or perhaps they simply disappeared and reappeared, and in that instant of darkness I heard the footsteps again, but closer now, much closer, right outside the tent. The crunch of leaves just inches from where we lay. A twig snapped with the sharp crack of breaking bone, so near that I jerked involuntarily, convinced that whatever was out there was about to tear through the nylon and reach inside. The voice returned, but this time it came from directly above us, as if something were leaning over the tent, speaking down through the fabric. The words were clearer now, though they made no sense. Fragments of sentences in a language almost but not quite recognizable, syllables that twisted in my ears like smoke. And underneath the words, barely audible, was something else. A sound like breathing, but wrong. Too wet, too deep, rhythm all askew. I don't know how long we lay there frozen. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing. Minutes might have been hours. The sounds continued in waves, periods of terrifying proximity followed by brief respites of silence that were somehow worse, pregnant with anticipation. The footsteps would circle, approach, retreat. The voice would call from impossible directions. Those red eyes would appear and vanish like dying embers in the dark. My mind began to fracture under the strain. I caught myself questioning whether my companion was still next to me, or if he'd somehow slipped away without my noticing. I could hear his breathing, feel his presence, but in the darkness nothing felt certain anymore. Maybe I'd been alone all along. Maybe the whole hiking trip was a delusion. Maybe I was still in the city, in my apartment, experiencing some kind of psychotic break. But no, the cold was too real, the fear too visceral. This was happening. This was actually happening. Near what I estimated to be 3 a.m, the activity intensified. The footsteps multiplied, surrounding the tent in a cacophony of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. It sounded like dozens of entities circling us, though I knew, or thought I knew, that was impossible. The voice fractured into harmonies, overlapping calls that seemed to come from the ground, the trees, the sky itself. And through it all, those eyes kept appearing at different angles, different heights, as if whatever possessed them could alter its form at will. I realized I was whispering prayers I hadn't thought of since childhood, fragments of half-remembered words meant to ward off evil. Beside me, my companion was muttering too, a constant stream of denials and bargains. We were breaking down, our rationality crumbling under the sustained assault of the impossible. Then, as abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The silence that followed was total and absolute. No footsteps, no voice, no movement at all. Even the normal forest sounds, the insects, the small nocturnal creatures, had vanished, as if every living thing for miles had simply ceased to exist. The absence of sound was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. We waited in that silence, neither of us daring to move or speak. I kept expecting the sounds to resume, for the red eyes to reappear, for something to finally tear through the tent and end this one way or another. But there was nothing, just emptiness and the sound of our own ragged breathing. Dawn came eventually, light seeping through the tent fabric with agonizing slowness. As the darkness lifted, I could see my companion's face, pale, drawn, eyes wide with residual terror. We looked at each other for a long moment, and in his expression I saw a mirror of my own desperate need to believe we'd shared some kind of mass hallucination, a folie à deux brought on by altitude and exhaustion, and too many campfire stories. We emerged from the tent into cold morning air. The clearing looked exactly as we'd left it, our gear still packed neatly, the stove sitting where we'd placed it, no signs of disturbance. The forest around us was peaceful, suffused with that gentle mountain dawn light that makes everything seem clean and new. Birds sang in the trees. A light breeze stirred the leaves. I walked the perimeter of our campsite, searching for evidence. Footprints, broken branches at unusual heights, anything to validate what we'd experienced. There was nothing. The ground showed only our own tracks from the previous evening. The surrounding brush was undisturbed. It was as if nothing had happened at all. We packed in silence, both of us moving with the desperate efficiency of people fleeing disaster. Neither of us suggested staying to investigate further or continuing our planned multi-day hike. We needed to get off this mountain, needed to return to civilization and normalcy and the comfortable lie that the world makes sense. The descent took 3 hours. 3 hours during which we barely spoke, each of us locked in our own attempts to rationalize the night away. Maybe it had been a prank by other hikers, elaborate and cruel. Maybe there'd been some acoustic phenomenon, some trick of the mountain that made sounds behave strangely. Maybe we'd both eaten something that caused shared hallucinations. We cycled through explanations, each more desperate than the last. When we reached the parking lot at the trailhead, we stood by our car in the harsh light of midday, blinking like creatures that had been too long underground. My companion said something about never coming back here, about how Blood Mountain had earned its name. I nodded, ready to agree, ready to put this behind us and never speak of it again. That's when I saw them in the tree line at the edge of the lot. 2 points of red light, watching us from the shadows beneath the pines. I grabbed my companion's arm, pointed, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows and ordinary daylight. He asked what I'd seen, concern creeping into his voice. I told him it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks after the sleepless night. But I know what I saw. And as we drove away, down the winding mountain road back toward the world of electric lights and locked doors, I couldn't shake the certainty that those eyes had been real, that everything had been real. The worst part isn't remembering what happened on the mountain. The worst part is this. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, measured steps that pause just at my threshold. And sometimes, in that moment between waking and sleep, I see red light bleeding under the doorframe. I tell myself it's paranoia, lingering trauma from that night. I tell myself the sounds are just neighbors, the light just a reflection from the street. I tell myself that whatever was on Blood Mountain stayed on Blood Mountain. But I don't really believe it, because yesterday I saw my hiking companion for the first time since that trip. We'd been avoiding each other, tacitly agreeing to let the whole thing fade into awkward memory. I ran into him at a coffee shop, and we made uncomfortable small talk, dancing around what happened. As he was leaving, he paused and asked me something in a voice barely above a whisper. Had I been hearing things? At home? In the city? Had I seen anything strange? I lied and said no. The relief in his eyes told me he was lying too. We both heard it then, clear as day despite the noise of the coffee shop. That voice, feminine and distorted, calling from somewhere that sounded like it was both very far away and right beside us. The same voice from the mountain. Other patrons looked around confused, trying to identify the source of the odd sound. My companion and I locked eyes. In that moment, I understood that we hadn't left Blood Mountain at all, or rather something from Blood Mountain had followed us back. And now I lie awake at night wondering, was there ever really a mountain? Was there ever a hike? Or has my entire life been one long descent into something I don't have names for? Something that's always been there, just waiting for me to notice those red eyes staring out from behind the veil of what I used to call reality? I don't know anymore. I don't know anything anymore, except that the footsteps are getting closer.